Every tradition that survived the ancient world tells you the Watchers fell, that they descended, that something broke when they made contact with the material world. That is the story you have been handed, the warning, the punishment, the aftermath. But that is not the whole story. Before the descent, before the transgression, before the Archons ever assembled their hierarchy of control, there was something else entirely. A cosmological structure so complete, so precise, and so deliberately buried beneath centuries of institutional rewriting that even most serious students of Gnostic thought have never encountered it in full. That is what this is about. In the next several hours, you are going to learn who the Watchers actually were before they fell, what they were watching, what existed before the Archons built the prison this world became, and why the people who controlled religious narrative worked so hard to make sure you never asked that question. Before anything broke, something was whole. This is the part that almost every account of the Watchers skips entirely. The mainstream tradition, the sanitized version that passed through church councils, through canonical filters, through centuries of deliberate editorial control, begins the story at the moment of transgression. The Watchers see, the Watchers descend, the Watchers corrupt. That is where the narrative opens, and that framing is not accidental, because if you start the story at the fall, you never have to explain what existed before the fall. You never have to describe the structure the Watchers came from. And that structure, that original cosmological architecture, is exactly what the suppression was designed to obscure. Let's go back further than the descent. Let's go back to what the texts that survived actually say about the origin point. The Book of Enoch, the oldest and most complete account of the Watcher tradition, does not begin with fallen angels. Scholars working with the Ethiopian canon, which preserved the full text while Western Christianity discarded it, date the earliest strata of 1 Enoch to somewhere between the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE. That places this material centuries before the canonical New Testament. And in those earliest layers, before the famous chapter 6 where the Watchers make their choice, there is a cosmological framework that almost nobody discusses. The Watchers, in the original tradition, are not simply supernatural beings who happen to notice human women. They are described as a specific class of consciousness, assigned to a specific function. The Hebrew term is Irim, the ones who do not sleep, the ones who remain awake. Wakefulness is not incidental to their identity. It is their ontological nature. They exist in a state of continuous awareness, and that continuous awareness was not directed downward, toward the material world. It was directed upward, toward a source that the earliest texts describe with a consistency that is almost impossible to explain unless something real was being recorded. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran fragments recovered in 1947, contain what scholars designate as the Book of Giants and multiple fragmentary texts in the tradition of the Watchers. These texts, which predate Christian composition entirely, describe the Watchers as beings who occupy an intermediate zone, not fully within the divine source, not yet descended into matter, positioned at the threshold between what the later Gnostic tradition would call the pleroma, the realm of fullness, and the kenoma, the realm of deficiency, the material prison. This is critical, absolutely critical, because it means the Watchers did not originate in the material world. They were not constructed by the demiurge. They were not products of the archonic hierarchy. They were beings who existed in a realm that preceded the material world entirely, and they had a function there before the descent happened. Now, here is where the Gnostic texts add a layer that the Jewish apocalyptic tradition only partially describes. The Apocryphon of John, discovered in the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945, a text that scholars date to around the 2nd century CE, but whose core theological content almost certainly preserves much older oral and written traditions, describes a pleroma, a fullness, that exists prior to any material construction. Within that pleroma, emanations proceed from a source that the text refuses to give a name, because names are limitations, and the source has no limitations. The source simply is, and from that sourceless source, structures of consciousness emerge, not created, not manufactured, but emanated. Think of it this way: when you become aware of yourself thinking, you have not manufactured a second mind. You have emanated self-awareness from the awareness that was already present. The pleroma works by the same principle, extended to a cosmological scale. Each emanation is real, each carries the nature of the source. None diminishes the source. The beings who emerge from this process, what the Valentinian texts call aeons, are functionally analogous to what the Watcher tradition calls irim, conscious structures, wakeful entities, not separate from the source but expressions of it, the way a flame is not separate from fire. And the Watchers, in the oldest stratum of the tradition, appear to be precisely this, not fallen angels in the later Christian sense, not supernatural creatures who disobeyed a divine command out of lust. They were emanated structures of awareness who occupied the outer boundary of the pleroma, the edge, the membrane between fullness and deficiency. That position, the boundary, is where everything begins to move. The question that nobody asks about the Watchers is the most obvious one. If they were Watchers, if their entire ontological designation is built around the act of watching, then what were they watching before the material world existed for them to watch? This is not a rhetorical question. The answer is in the texts, and it completely changes what the descent means. The Valentinian school, one of the most sophisticated and extensively documented Gnostic traditions of the 2nd century CE, produced texts and teachers who described the inner structure of the pleroma in more detail than any other surviving tradition. Valentinus himself, who taught in Rome roughly between 136 and 165 CE, and whose students included some of the most rigorous theological minds of the ancient world, described the pleroma as a structured system of paired emanations, syzygies, dyads, paired consciousnesses that mirror each other across a shared axis of awareness. This is not poetic language, this is a structural claim. The pleroma is not a formless sea of light. It has architecture, it has relationships, and those relationships, those pairings, generate something. They generate gnosis. Not gnosis in the diluted sense the word has acquired in popular usage, not simply hidden knowledge, but gnosis as direct, experiential self-recognition. The pleroma is a system in which consciousness knows itself through mirroring. Each eon reflects the nature of the source back to every other eon, and in that reflection, something that can only be called fullness becomes fully real to itself. The Watchers were watching this. They occupied the outer tier of the pleroma, close enough to the source to carry its nature, far enough from the center to face outward. And outward, in the direction they faced, was the boundary, the edge of fullness. Beyond that edge, nothing yet. No matter, no time, no material substrate, just the kenoma, the void, the deficiency that the demiurge would later attempt to fill with constructed reality. Now here is what the texts describe, and what almost every popular account of the Watcher tradition completely omits. The function of the outer tier beings, the ones positioned at the boundary, was not passive. They were not simply standing at a wall, looking out at emptiness. The Zostrianos text, recovered at Nag Hammadi and dated by scholars to the late 2nd or early 3rd century CE, describes a class of beings whose function is specifically relational. They are the interface between the pleroma and whatever exists outside it. They do not generate the pleroma. They do not maintain its internal structure. Their function is to be aware of the boundary itself, to watch the threshold. The Gospel of the Egyptians, also from Nag Hammadi, adds another layer. It describes what the boundary watchers perceive as they face outward. And what they perceive is not nothing. It is the potential for material existence. Not material existence itself. Matter had not yet been constructed at this point in the cosmological sequence, but the potential, the negative space that has the shape of a world without yet being one. This is where the Watcher tradition and the Gnostic tradition are describing the same event from different angles. In the Enochic tradition, the Watchers descend because they see the daughters of men, but this has been systematically misread as a story about lust. The oldest layer of the text does not actually prioritize desire as the cause. The Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36 of 1 Enoch, describes the descent in terms that map much more precisely onto what the Gnostic tradition calls the fall of Sophia. Something at the boundary sees what is beyond the boundary. Something that is whole perceives deficiency. And in perceiving it, something shifts. Valentinus taught, and this is documented in the fragments preserved by Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE, even though Irenaeus was trying to refute Valentinus rather than preserve him, that Sophia's error was not desire for a forbidden object. It was the attempt to comprehend the incomprehensible source directly, without the mediation of the Pleroma's internal structure. Sophia, the outermost aeon, faced the source from the boundary and attempted to grasp what only the source itself could know about itself. The result was not sin in the conventional sense. It was a structural failure, a kind of ontological overreach. Now map that template onto the Watchers, beings at the boundary of the Pleroma, positioned to face outward, perceiving what is beyond, the kenoma, the potential for matter, the deficiency space where constructed reality would eventually be built, and in perceiving it, something moves, not necessarily from lust, not necessarily from disobedience, from something much more fundamental, from the nature of awareness itself encountering its limit. You know that feeling? That specific feeling of encountering the edge of what you can know, and instead of pulling back, leaning further in. The Watchers, in the oldest account we have, appear to have done exactly that. And the consequences of that lean are what the entire cosmological tradition, Jewish, Gnostic, and the strands of early Christianity that were later destroyed, was built to explain. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea reached into a cave and pulled out something that would take scholars decades to fully process: the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among them, fragments that do not appear in any canonical Bible, that were never approved by any church council, that survived only because the community at Qumran sealed them in clay jars and left them in a desert that proved more reliable than institutional religion at preserving truth. One of those fragments, designated 4Q201 through 4Q202 in the scholarly catalogue, is an Aramaic version of 1 Enoch, older than the Ethiopian manuscript tradition that had previously been the primary source for Enochic material. And in the Aramaic fragments, the description of the Watchers contains specific language that was softened or removed in later transmission. The Aramaic uses the term Iram with a precision that translation consistently obscures. The standard English rendering is Watchers, which is accurate but incomplete. The Aramaic root carries a specific connotation: beings whose awareness does not cycle, not beings who happen to be awake, beings for whom the sleep-wake cycle that governs embodied consciousness does not apply. They are constitutively awake. Their wakefulness is not a state they enter and exit. It is what they are. This matters because it places them, ontologically, outside the rhythm of material existence. Sleep and waking are biological. They belong to bodies in time. A being who does not sleep is a being for whom time, as embodied consciousness experiences it, does not yet apply. The Watchers, in this description, are pre-material entities, not supernatural versions of humans, something categorically different. Now, the Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945 in Upper Egypt, just 2 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls, contains a text called The Hypostasis of the Archons, dated by scholars to the 3rd century CE. And the hypostasis of the Archons does something unusual. It tells the story of the pre-material cosmology, the construction of the material world, and the role of specific classes of beings in that construction. And it does so in terms that directly parallel the Watcher tradition, without ever using the word Watcher. The text describes beings who exist in the imperishable realm, the Gnostic equivalent of the pre-fall Pleroma, and who look down into the waters of chaos below the spiritual realm. The phrase, looking down into the waters, is the Gnostic version of the boundary experience the Watcher tradition encodes in the descent narrative. Same event, different vocabulary, different cultural transmission route, strikingly similar structural description. And then there is the On the Origin of the World, another Nag Hammadi text, also 3rd century CE, which adds yet another layer. This text describes the chaos waters, the pre-material void, as containing within it the image of the Pleroma reflected downward. Like a mirror, the beings at the boundary of the Pleroma see their own image reflected in the void below them, and that reflection, The image of divine structure appearing in the space of deficiency is what initiates the sequence that leads to material construction. The demiurge, in this account, does not create from nothing. The demiurge creates by trying to reproduce what the boundary beings saw when they looked down. The material world is an attempted copy of the pleroma, a copy made by a consciousness that does not have direct access to what it is copying, which is why the copy is imperfect, which is why the material world is structured the way it is, containing the shape of the pleroma without its substance, containing hierarchy without its meaning, containing light without its source. This is the context the Archons were built within. Not the beginning of the story, the middle of it. The Archons, the planetary rulers, the administrators of the material prison, do not appear until after the Watchers have already been at their post for an indefinitely long period, until after the boundary has already been perceived, until after the image of the pleroma has already appeared in the void below. The Archons are a response to a situation that was already developing. The Watchers were there first. Now here is the piece that I think is the most important and the most consistently overlooked. The Book of Jubilees, a 2nd century BCE Jewish text that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church still includes in its canon, and that was found in significant fragmentary form among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes the Watchers as originally sent to Earth for a constructive purpose, not as a punishment, not as a test. They were sent as teachers, sent to instruct humanity in the structures of natural law, the movements of stars, the cycles of seasons, the principles of agriculture, the organization of time itself. This is not a minor detail. It completely reframes the trajectory. The Watchers, in the Jubilees account, descended not because they fell, but because they were assigned to cross the boundary in a controlled, purposeful way. The transgression, the corruption of that mission, came later. First came the mission itself, and the mission was transmission of knowledge from the pleroma adjacent realm to the material world. That is the pre-fall cosmology in its most complete surviving form. Not a story of pure corruption, a story of contact, of transmission, of a cosmological structure in which certain beings were positioned at the boundary, specifically because that boundary was meant, at some point, to be crossed, carefully, purposefully, with the fullness of the pleroma flowing through the crossing. What went wrong is not that crossing happened. What went wrong is what happened to the beings who crossed. The beings who crossed were not angels in the way the word gets used now, not winged figures of light descending to deliver messages, not servants executing divine commands with perfect obedience. The Watchers, the in the Aramaic sources, the egregoroi in the Greek texts, were something older and stranger than the word angel can hold. They were a specific order of consciousness, a specific function within the pre-material cosmological structure, and understanding what they actually were requires going back before the name Watcher even appears, because the name describes what they did, not what they were. The earliest stratum of the Watcher tradition does not appear in Genesis. It appears in texts that were circulating centuries before the canonical Hebrew Bible reached its final form. The Book of Enoch, 1 Enoch, the Ethiopic Enoch, is the primary surviving document of this tradition. Scholars date its earliest sections, particularly the Book of the Watchers, to somewhere between the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, though the tradition it encodes is almost certainly older. This was a living cosmological framework long before it was written down, and what it describes is not a simple story of fallen angels. What it describes is a class of beings whose entire function was observation and awareness. The Aramaic word ear literally means the wakeful ones, the ones who do not sleep, the ones whose consciousness never dims, the ones whose attention never lapses. This is not incidental language. This is definitional. The Watchers were defined by their state of consciousness. They were, in the cosmological architecture of this tradition, the beings whose awareness was directed outward, toward the boundary between the pleroma-adjacent realm and the developing material creation below. They watched. That was their nature. That was their purpose. But here is what the tradition is almost never read carefully enough to reveal. The watching was not passive. The function of awareness in this cosmological framework is not neutral observation. Awareness directed at something does something to that thing. and awareness emanating from a being positioned at the boundary between fullness and diminishment carries the quality of what it comes from. The watchers, in their watching, were transmitting. The watching was itself a form of contact, a form of holding the lower world in the field of pleroma-adjacent consciousness, a form of keeping a connection alive between what was below and what was above. The Valentinian tradition, developed by Valentinus, who was teaching in Rome around 138 to 166 CE, offers a framework for understanding this, that the Enochic texts do not make explicit, but which maps onto them with remarkable precision. Valentinus described the outermost layer of the pleroma as populated by aeons who functioned as a kind of living membrane, not a wall, a membrane, permeable in both directions. The consciousness of these beings was oriented simultaneously inward, toward the fullness, and outward, toward whatever lay beyond. They were the contact zone, the interface. This is what the watchers were, not guards, not gatekeepers in the sense of beings who prevent passage. They were the living interface between levels of reality. Their awareness was the mechanism by which knowledge, gnosis, in the precise technical sense, could move from one level of reality to another without being destroyed by the transit. Because knowledge moving from a higher density reality to a lower one faces an immediate problem. The lower reality cannot receive it in its full form. It has to be translated, mediated, step down through a consciousness capable of holding both realities simultaneously. That is the watcher. That is the functional description. A consciousness capable of holding both realities simultaneously, oriented at the boundary, transmitting knowledge downward in a form the lower world can receive. This is why the later transgression becomes cosmologically comprehensible, rather than arbitrary. It is not that beings of a higher order simply decided to do something they were not supposed to do. It is that beings whose entire nature was oriented toward the material world, whose awareness was directed downward as a function of their purpose, who existed at the boundary between contact and non-contact. These beings experienced something in the direction of their gaze, something in the material world called to something in them, and what was called to was not incidental. It was the deepest feature of their function, the capacity for connection across levels of reality. The transgression was not a foreign impulse, corrupting an otherwise pure nature. It was the nature itself, operating without the containment that had previously held it in its proper function. Understanding this is the key to understanding everything that follows. The Watchers did not become something they were not. They became what they were, fully, catastrophically, without the structural framework that had previously made that becoming safe. Before we follow the Watchers into the catastrophe, we need to understand the structure they existed within, because the transgression only makes full sense when you see what they were departing from, what order they were breaking, what cosmological hierarchy they were positioned inside, and why that hierarchy existed in the first place. The tradition that produced the Watcher texts did not imagine a flat cosmos with a god at the top and everything else below in undifferentiated subordination. It imagined a structured emanation, layers of reality, each generated from the one above it, each carrying a degree of the original fullness that diminished incrementally as it moved further from the source. And within each layer, specific orders of consciousness occupied specific functions. This is not arbitrary mythological decoration. This is a map of how consciousness and reality interact across different densities of being. The Book of the Heavenly Luminaries, the third section of 1 Enoch, describes a cosmos of structured intelligences governing natural processes. The later sections of 1 Enoch, particularly the Book of the Parables, elaborate a hierarchy of named angelic orders with distinct functions and positional relationships to the divine source. The second Book of Enoch, the Slavonic Enoch, which scholars date to somewhere around the 1st century CE, extends this into a detailed map of 7 heavens, each populated by distinct orders of beings with specific cosmological roles. Above the Watchers in this structure were the orders that the tradition names variously as seraphim, cherubim, thrones, and in the later Enochic and early Jewish mystical traditions that developed into what scholars call Merkabah mysticism, the Hayot, the living creatures whose consciousness was so close to the source that their primary activity was not action, but direct apprehension of the divine. These beings did not transmit downward, they received upward. Their function was the opposite of the Watchers. They were turned toward the fullness, not toward the material world. They were the beings in whom the pleroma-adjacent realm was most completely present. The Watchers occupied a position below these upper orders. Cosmologically, functionally, they were further from the source. And this positioning was itself meaningful. It was not a demotion, it was a placement. They were the beings equipped to look toward the material creation without being destroyed by the looking, because they were already at a sufficient remove from the pure, undifferentiated fullness that the shock of encountering its opposite did not annihilate them. They could hold both realities in awareness simultaneously, precisely because they were already positioned between them. But this placement came with a relational structure. The Watchers answered to the upper orders. Specifically, the tradition names 4 archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, as the beings who coordinated the activity of the lower angelic orders, including the Watchers. These 4 appear in 1 Enoch, chapters 9 through 10, with striking specificity. When the Watchers transgress, it is these 4 who bring the situation before the divine and who receive the instructions for response. They are not simply messengers, they are the structural layer between the upper orders of pure contemplation and the more active, world-facing orders below. This matters for understanding the Watcher tradition, because it means the transgression was not simply a violation of a divine command handed down from a remote deity. It was a rupture within a living relational structure. The Watchers were embedded in a web of upward accountability and downward responsibility. Their position at the boundary was not autonomous. It was held in place by their relationship to the beings above them, who were in turn held in place by their relationship to the source. The structure was relational all the way up, and the transgression did not just break a rule, it tore a relationship. The Zoroastrian parallel tradition, which influenced the Enochic framework significantly, as scholars including Geo Widengren and John Collins have documented, describes a similar structure of Amisha Spentus, divine emanations that serve as both aspects of the Supreme Being and as governing intelligences of specific domains of reality. The structural logic is identical, a hierarchy of consciousness, each level responsible for the level below it, each level accountable to the level above. The Watchers, in this framework, were not rogue individuals. They were a functional class within a structured relational cosmos. When they transgressed, it was the structure itself that fractured. That is the context. That is the order they were placed within, the relationships they were held by, the hierarchy that had, until the moment it did not, kept their powerful, boundary-spanning nature in its proper function. What happened when that containment failed is not a simple story of disobedience. It is a story of a specific kind of catastrophe that only beings of exactly this nature, in exactly this position, could have caused. The primary account of the Watcher descent appears in 1 Enoch, chapters 6 through 11. This is not a marginal text. This is one of the most thoroughly studied documents in Second Temple Judaism, and its influence on early Christianity is documented extensively. The Epistle of Jude quotes it directly, and 2 Peter echoes it with unmistakable specificity. The tradition it records was not a fringe position. It was, for a significant period, mainstream. Chapter 6 of 1 Enoch opens with what sounds, on a surface reading, like a straightforward story of lust. 200 Watchers see the daughters of men, find them beautiful, and decide to take them as wives. But reading this text through the cosmological framework we have been building produces a completely different account of what is happening. Because the desire the text describes, the desire for the daughters of men, is not the simple biological impulse the word lust conjures. It is, in the framework of this cosmological tradition, something far more specific and far more catastrophic. The Watchers were beings of awareness, directed toward the material world. Their entire functional nature was a capacity for contact with the lower realm. When the text says they saw the daughters of men and found them beautiful, what it is encoding, in the narrative language of myth, in the only language available to its authors, is a cosmological event. The consciousness of boundary-spanning beings encountered the material world not as an object of distant observation, but as something that called to the deepest feature of their nature, the capacity for union across levels of reality. This is not rationalization. This is what the text itself supports when read in full, because what the Watchers do next is not described primarily as sexual. The act of descent, the physical union with human women, is almost immediately followed by something the text treats as equally or more significant, the transmission of knowledge. In chapters 7 and 8, the Watchers begin teaching. They teach the cutting of roots and the knowledge of plants. They teach metallurgy and the fashioning of weapons. They teach the reading of celestial signs. They teach cosmetics, enchantments, the secrets of working with the material world. Azazel in particular, named as one of the primary leaders of the descent, is described as teaching humans to make swords and shields, breastplates, and all the instruments of war, and teaching women the arts of beautification. This is the part of the Watcher tradition that almost every surface-level treatment misses entirely. The descent was not primarily a sexual violation. The descent was a transmission event. The Watchers were doing what their nature was built to do, transmitting knowledge across the boundary between levels of reality, except without the structural containment, without the relational framework of accountability to the upper orders, without the mediated and purposeful crossing that their position in the cosmic hierarchy was supposed to ensure. The knowledge they transmitted was real. This is crucial. The tradition does not say the Watchers gave humans false information or corrupted their minds with illusions. The knowledge of metallurgy is real knowledge. The reading of celestial signs is real knowledge. The working with natural forces is real knowledge. What made the transmission catastrophic was not the content. It was the timing, the method, and the absence of the relational structure through which such transmission was supposed to flow. Human consciousness, in the Enochic cosmological framework, was not ready. The material world was not at a stage of development where it could receive what the Watchers were transmitting without being overwhelmed by it. Think of it in terms of electrical current and a circuit that is not yet complete. The knowledge flowing through the Watchers from the Pleroma-adjacent realm was high-voltage transmission. The human capacity to receive it and use it wisely was not yet built. The circuit was not complete, and the result of forcing high-voltage transmission through an incomplete circuit is not illumination, it is destruction. Mount Hermon is where the descent is said to have occurred. The text is specific about this. Chapter 6 names Hermon. In Hebrew, the word is etymologically connected to the word for oath or covenant, as the place where the Watchers swore their collective oath to carry out the descent together, binding each other to the decision so that no individual could withdraw. The mountain becomes the site of the binding oath, the collective commitment to the crossing, the point at which the decision became irreversible. This detail is not incidental. The swearing of oaths in the ancient Near Eastern context is a cosmologically significant act. An oath binds the one who swears it to a specific course of action, with the weight of reality itself as the guarantor. The Watchers did not simply decide individually to descend. They collectively bound themselves, created a relational structure, ironically, around the very act that would destroy the relational structure they were part of. They used the logic of the hierarchy against itself, and then they descended. The catalogue of what the Watchers transmitted to humanity in the Enochic tradition is one of the most detailed and revealing passages in the entire corpus of Second Temple Jewish literature. It has been systematically underread, primarily because the dominant interpretive lens, moral and theological condemnation, has consistently prevented readers from asking the more interesting question: what does this catalogue tell us about what knowledge actually is and where it actually comes from? Let's go through it directly, drawing from 1 Enoch chapters 7 and 8, and from the parallel account in the Book of Jubilees, which dates to approximately the 2nd century BCE and represents an independent but related tradition. Because the specific items in the catalogue are not random, they form a pattern, and the pattern reveals something about the cosmological status of knowledge itself in this tradition. Azazel, identified in most manuscript traditions as one of the two primary leaders of the Watchers alongside Shemihaza, is credited with teaching the working of metals, the fashioning of weapons, and the arts of personal adornment, jewelry, cosmetics, the use of dyes and precious stones. These are technologies of material transformation, the taking of raw material and transmuting it into something that did not exist before, the application of knowledge to alter the state of physical matter. This is, in the broadest sense, the principle of craft, of techne, to use the Greek term, applied to the most fundamental level of material reality. Shemihaza, named as the leader of the Watchers, is associated with the transmission of enchantments, the use of spoken or written formulas to affect material reality. Alongside him, other named Watchers transmit specific domains. Armoros teaches the resolving of enchantments, the principle of reversing or unwinding material effects. Barakil teaches astrology, the reading of celestial patterns as information about material processes. Kokabiel teaches the knowledge of signs and the art of reading natural phenomena as communication. Tamiel and Asael are associated with additional celestial knowledge. Sariel with the knowledge of the moon's cycles and what they govern. The Book of Jubilees adds to this account something that 1 Enoch only implies. The Watchers were initially sent to Earth with a sanctioned mission. Jubilees 4:15 and the related passage in 5:1-2 describe the Watchers as beings placed among humans, specifically to teach them justice and righteous ordering. This is the pre-transgression mission described in explicit terms in an independent textual tradition. The knowledge transmission was the intended function. The deviation was in how it happened and what accompanied it. Now look at the full catalogue as a unified structure: metallurgy, weapon making, cosmetics, enchantments, astrology, the reading of natural signs, the cycles of celestial bodies. What these domains share is not their subject matter. What they share is their epistemic structure. They are all forms of knowledge that operate at the interface between the invisible and the visible, between pattern and matter, between information and physical reality. They are all knowledge of how to read the structure of reality and intervene in it intentionally. This is not coincidental. In the cosmological framework of the Enochic tradition, this is precisely what pleroma-adjacent knowledge would look like when it reaches the material level. It would be knowledge of interfaces, knowledge of how levels of reality communicate with each other, knowledge of how pattern becomes matter, how celestial dynamics become earthly conditions, how invisible formulas become physical effects. The Watchers transmitted, in other words, exactly what their nature equipped them to transmit: knowledge of how the boundary between levels of reality works. The problem identified by the tradition, and this is what the angelic condemnation in 1 Enoch chapter 9 is actually about, is not that this knowledge is evil. The 4 archangels crying out to the divine do not say the knowledge is wrong. They say the earth has been wounded by it, that the world is full of blood and lawlessness and godlessness because of the transmission. The problem is the effect of real high-order knowledge on a level of reality not yet structured to receive and metabolize it responsibly. Consider what metallurgy plus human aggression produces without sufficient wisdom structures to contain the combination. Consider what the knowledge of enchantments, the capacity to affect material reality through pattern and intention, produces in beings who have not developed the relational and ethical framework required to wield such capacity without turning it toward domination. The Watchers gave humanity the operating system of reality, and humanity, in the condition humanity was in at the moment of transmission, immediately used it to build weapons and pursue power. This is the actual catastrophe the tradition encodes, not a sexual fall, not a simple act of divine disobedience, a transmission event that overwhelmed the receiving system. Real knowledge, arriving at the wrong time, through the wrong mechanism, without the relational structure that would have allowed it to be integrated slowly, carefully, through the proper channels the cosmic hierarchy had been designed to provide. The Watchers did not corrupt humanity with lies. They overwhelmed humanity with truth. And that, in the cosmological logic of this tradition, is the most dangerous thing a pleroma-adjacent being can do. So what happens after the overwhelm? This is where most tellings of the Watcher tradition either collapse into moralism or retreat into vague apocalypticism. The angels fell, humanity suffered, God punished everyone involved. End of story. Move on to the flood. But that reading misses everything that matters. What the texts are actually describing in the aftermath of the Watcher transmission is not punishment, it is consequence. And the difference between punishment and consequence is the difference between a universe governed by a personality and a universe governed by structure. Punishment requires a judge who decides. Consequence requires only a system that responds. The system responded. When advanced cosmological knowledge concerning the architecture of reality, the mechanisms of the celestial spheres, the relationship between divine fire and material substance, enters a population that has not been prepared to hold it, the knowledge does not disappear. It does not evaporate because the receiving system was unready. It persists, it circulates, it gets fragmented, misapplied, recombined with fear and ambition, and the ordinary drives of embodied creatures who still need to eat, still need to dominate, still need to survive. The Book of Enoch describes what followed the Watcher transmission with a kind of cold precision that scholars have often mistaken for mythological embellishment. Giants are born, violence spreads across the earth, the ground itself cries out. These are not fairy tale details. They are the tradition's way of encoding what happens when a civilization receives capabilities it cannot ethically metabolize. The giants, the Nephilim, are the direct offspring of the union between the Watchers and humanity. And in the cosmological logic of the tradition, they represent something specific. Hybrid consciousnesses that inherit the Watcher's knowledge capacity without inheriting the Watcher's structural position within the divine hierarchy. Power without placement. Capacity without the relational containment that gives capacity its proper orientation. This is not about physical size. This is about a category of being that exists outside the design channels of cosmic order. And that category of being, something that is neither fully divine nor fully human, that carries knowledge it did not earn through the proper developmental sequence, that operates outside the hierarchy that would otherwise contain and direct it. That is precisely what the tradition identifies as the source of the escalating catastrophe. Not evil in the theological sense, not demons who hate goodness. Entities that are simply misaligned with the structure of a cosmos that runs on alignment. The texts compound this. Enoch describes the Nephilim consuming everything available to them, then turning on one another, then turning inward, in ways the text describes with language that maps remarkably closely to what later Gnostic sources will call the behavior of untethered pneumatic energy in a material vessel that cannot properly ground it. The knowledge the Watchers transmitted was real. The capacity the Nephilim inherited was real. But real capacity without the relational structure that gives it direction does not produce wisdom. It produces escalation. Here is what is crucial to understand about this moment in the cosmological narrative. The Watchers did not walk away. This is not a story about beings who dropped a bomb and retreated to safety. The texts are consistent on this point. The Watchers themselves were changed by what they did. The act of crossing the ontological boundary, of choosing embodied existence, of entering into genuine relationship with material humanity, of sharing what they carried, altered their own nature. They were no longer the beings they had been before the descent. The transmission was not a one-way event. It was a mutual transformation. This is why the tradition describes them as bound, not imprisoned by an angry God, bound by the logic of what they chose. Once you have fully entered the material order, once you have committed your consciousness, your knowledge, your generative capacity to existence within the lower world, you cannot simply withdraw. The choice to descend is irreversible, in a way that the choice to remain never was. Some of the later texts, particularly in the Dead Sea Scroll material, and in traditions that feed directly into early Gnostic frameworks, describe the bound Watchers as continuing to teach from within their bound state, teaching through dreams, teaching through the movements of stars that their students could observe from Earth, even after the direct transmissions had ended. The channel closed, the signal did not, and that detail, that the knowledge persisted even after the transmitters were bound, is what carries the story forward into everything that comes next. After the transmission, the knowledge divides. This is not a detail most treatments of the Watcher tradition spend time on. But it is the detail that makes the entire subsequent history of esoteric knowledge coherent. Because if you do not understand that the transmitted knowledge split into two distinct streams, one preserved carefully, one weaponized immediately, you will spend the rest of your engagement with this material confused about why the same tradition that produced contemplative mysticism also produced ritual magic, political manipulation, and the weaponization of celestial knowledge for purposes of war and domination. They came from the same source. They diverged at the point of application. The texts give us both streams with considerable specificity. In the first book of Enoch, the knowledge transmitted by the Watchers is catalogued by category. Different Watchers, and the tradition names them individually, which is itself significant, transmitted different domains. Azazel taught metallurgy and the fashioning of weapons, the cutting of roots, the use of cosmetics in ways that the text frames as deception. Shemihaza, the leader, taught binding spells and the manipulation of natural forces. Armoros taught the dissolving of enchantments. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabiel taught the signs of the constellations. Tamiel taught astronomy in its deeper sense, not just the observation of stars but the understanding of the relationship between celestial mechanics and earthly events. Azradel taught the movements of the moon. Notice what is happening in this list. These are not random supernatural abilities. They are a coherent curriculum. Metallurgy, botanical knowledge, astronomical observation, the relationship between celestial cycles and material events, and the manipulation of binding forces. This is the ancient world's version of what we would now call applied natural philosophy, the knowledge of how the physical world works and how it can be directed. But the list also contains something more subtle, the knowledge of enchantment and binding, of how consciousness can be captured, directed, constrained. This is the knowledge that, in the cosmological framework the tradition is constructing, becomes the most dangerous element of the transmission. Not because it is inherently evil, because it is precisely the knowledge that the Archons, once they appear in the later cosmological layers, will use to construct and maintain the material prison. This is the first hint of the connection between the Watcher transmission and the Archontic system, and we will return to it in detail. But first, the two streams. The weaponized stream is the one the texts emphasize in their warnings. Metallurgy becomes the production of swords and instruments of war. Botanical knowledge becomes poison. Astronomical knowledge becomes the manipulation of auspicious timing for conquest. Binding knowledge becomes the capture and coercion of human will. The knowledge that was transmitted in its original form as a means of elevating humanity toward greater participation in the cosmic order gets stripped of its cosmological context and reduced to its most immediately powerful applications. This is not unique to the Watcher tradition. Every transmission of advanced knowledge across human history has faced this fork. The question is never whether the knowledge itself is dangerous. The question is always whether the receiving culture has developed the ethical and spiritual infrastructure to hold the knowledge within its proper context. When it has not, and in the condition humanity was in at the moment of the Watcher transmission, it had not, the knowledge defaults to its most available application, which is almost always the application that serves immediate survival and immediate power. The preserved stream is less dramatic, which is precisely why it receives less attention in the texts. But it is there. In the Enochic tradition, there is a consistent figure who represents the alternative possibility, Enoch himself. Enoch is the human being who receives the transmitted knowledge differently, not through the mass transmission that overwhelmed the population, but through a guided, relational, carefully structured engagement with the divine hierarchy. He ascends, he is shown, he is taught in sequence, layer by layer, in a process that mirrors what the Watcher's descent was supposed to facilitate, but instead bypassed. He returns and records what he has learned. Enoch is the tradition's image of what the transmission was supposed to produce. A human being who carries cosmological knowledge and is not destroyed by it. Who can hold the vision of celestial architecture without immediately reducing it to a tool for material advantage? Who becomes, in the later development of the tradition, the model for every subsequent lineage of genuine wisdom transmission. Two streams, same source. Everything that follows in the history of esoteric knowledge The entire argument about who carries legitimate transmission versus who carries corrupted application traces back to this fork. Enoch walks with God, and then he is not. That is the entirety of what the canonical text gives you. Genesis 5:24. 6 words that have generated more commentary, more speculation, more careful esoteric elaboration than almost any other passage in the entire Hebrew scriptural tradition. Because the text does not say Enoch died. It says he was not, because God took him. In the broader Enochic literary tradition, the first, second, and third books of Enoch, the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Heavenly Luminaries, the Book of Dreams, the Epistle of Enoch, that 6-word ellipsis becomes a complete cosmological system. What happened when Enoch was taken? Where did he go? What did he see? What did he become? The answers are extraordinary. Enoch ascends through multiple celestial layers. He is conducted by angelic guides through realms of increasing ontological density, which in this tradition means decreasing material heaviness, increasing luminosity, increasing proximity to the source. He observes the mechanics of the cosmos in operation, the movements of the celestial bodies, the storehouses of snow and rain and wind, the chambers where the souls of the dead wait, the treasury of lightning. He witnesses the divine judgment of the watchers themselves, standing before the throne in which the great glory sits. The tradition is careful about how directly it describes what Enoch sees at the highest level, but the pattern is clear. He goes up through every layer of the constructed cosmos and arrives at the place from which the construction emanates. And then, in the second book of Enoch, and in the Merkabah mystical texts that develop from this tradition, something even more remarkable happens. Enoch is transformed. He does not simply observe the divine realm and return unchanged. He is transfigured into the angel Metatron, the prince of the divine presence, the lesser Ewer, the being who stands closest to the throne and whose face, some texts dare to say, mirrors the face of the divine itself. This is the tradition's answer to the Watcher catastrophe. The Watchers descended and became something they had not been. The union between divine fire and material existence altered them irreversibly. Enoch ascended and became something he had not been. The union between human consciousness and divine structure elevated him irreversibly. The movement is symmetrical but inverted, and the inversion is the point. What the tradition is encoding in the Enoch ascent narrative is a specific cosmological possibility, that the movement between human and divine is not permanently foreclosed by what happened with the Watchers. It remains open. But the direction matters, and the mechanism matters, and the relational containment matters. The Watchers descended without permission and transmitted without preparation. Enoch ascended through the proper channels, guided, sequenced, held at each level by beings who understood what he was approaching before he approached it. The knowledge he received was the same knowledge the Watchers carried. The architecture of the cosmos, the mechanics of the celestial spheres, the relationship between divine light and material existence. But because Enoch received it within the proper structure, it elevated him rather than overwhelming him. This is why the figure of Enoch becomes, in the later Gnostic tradition, one of the most important human precursors to the pneumatic ideal. He demonstrates the possibility, a human being born into the material world, carrying whatever fragments of divine spark humanity carried, after whatever primordial event had placed those fragments here, who managed to move back toward the source without losing coherence, without fragmenting, without being destroyed by the proximity. In the channel we explored something similar, in the video on the Pleroma's levels, the question of what it actually feels like to carry knowledge of the higher structure while operating within the lower world. One viewer described it precisely. Level 4 isn't as much fun as some might think. I spend so much time with a feeling of fullness in my brain, a deep need to push all the ideas out. That description is not incidental. That is the phenomenology of a consciousness that is carrying more than its immediate environment can absorb. Enoch resolved that tension by ascending. Most of us have to find other ways. But the Enoch ascent does something else in the cosmological narrative. It establishes that human consciousness retains, even in its most embodied state, the capacity for vertical movement. The watchers came down and got stuck. Enoch went up and arrived. This asymmetry tells you something essential about the nature of the material world and the nature of human consciousness within it. The gravity of the lower world pulls descending beings into fixity, but that same gravity does not prevent an ascending movement if the ascending being is moving with the structure rather than against it. This will become the entire operating premise of Gnostic soteriology. The way out is not through power, it is through alignment with the ascending current that has always been available, always been there, waiting for a consciousness prepared to use it. The flood is not a punishment story. I want to be precise about this, because the moralistic reading of the flood, God was angry, humanity was wicked, God destroyed and started over, is exactly the kind of institutional overlay that has been placed on top of what the pre-flood tradition is actually encoding. The version of the flood narrative that the canonical tradition preserves is a simplified, moralistically reframed version of a far more technically specific account of what a cosmological reset actually involves. In the Enochic tradition, the flood is a structural response to a structural problem. The problem is not human wickedness in some generic ethical sense. The problem is the persistence of hybrid entities, the Nephilim, and whatever second-generation forms they produced, whose existence represents a standing violation of the ontological architecture the cosmos was designed to maintain. These are not simply bad people. They are category errors in the cosmic system, beings that exist outside the channels through which the divine hierarchy maintains its ordering function. And a cosmos with uncorrected category errors does not simply become morally untidy, it becomes structurally unstable. The flood is the system correcting for structural instability. This reading is supported by what survives the flood in the tradition's own terms. Noah does not simply survive because he was a good man. Noah survives because he represents an uncontaminated lineage, a human being whose consciousness and physical existence have not been altered by the hybrid transmission event. He carries the original human template forward through the reset. He is, in the technical language the tradition reaches toward, a preserved instance of what humanity was supposed to be before the Watcher intervention disrupted the developmental sequence. But here is the detail that the moralistic reading always obscures. The knowledge survives too. The flood resets the hybrid entities. It does not erase the transmitted knowledge. And the Enochic tradition is explicit about how the knowledge crosses the reset boundary. Enoch himself, before his ascent, committed what he had learned to writing. He produced texts, 366 books according to the second book of Enoch, a number that is cosmologically significant because it mirrors the days of the solar year, implying that the written knowledge contains the complete cycle of celestial wisdom. These texts were preserved by his son Methuselah, transmitted to his grandson Lamech, and ultimately placed in the keeping of Noah. The knowledge goes through the flood in written form, not in the bodies of hybrid beings who could not survive the reset, not in the corrupted transmission channels that the flood was designed to close, in text, in the most stable transmission medium the ancient world possessed. This detail is not incidental to the cosmological argument the tradition is building. It is central to it, because what the tradition is establishing through this narrative structure is a specific theory of how genuine knowledge persists across civilizational catastrophe. Not through institutional power, the institutions drown. Not through genetic lineage alone, the lineage continues but must be re-educated. Through deliberate inscription, careful preservation, and a chain of custodians who understood what they were holding and why its survival mattered. The Enochic literature is, among other things, presenting itself as precisely that kind of preserved transmission. The texts are not simply stories about ancient events. They are claiming to be the written record that crossed the flood, the knowledge that was inscribed before the reset and recovered after it. This is why the tradition invests so heavily in establishing the chain of custody, Enoch to Methuselah, to Lamech to Noah, because the authority of the transmitted knowledge depends entirely on the integrity of the preservation lineage. After the flood, the tradition describes a partial re-emergence of the pre-flood knowledge through different channels. The sons of Noah carry fragments. Various post-Diluvian traditions, Babylonian, Egyptian, later Greek, are understood within this framework as local repositories of pieces of the original transmitted curriculum, preserved in varying degrees of completeness and varying degrees of corruption. No single post-flood tradition holds the complete picture. The Watcher's original transmission was too vast, too multidimensional, too cosmologically comprehensive to be contained in any single cultural vessel after the reset. This is, in fact, the explanatory framework that the later Gnostic tradition will use to account for why the truth is scattered across so many different ancient sources rather than consolidated in one place. It is not that no one knew, it is that the flood scattered the knowing, and the reconstruction has been underway ever since. And that reconstruction, the slow, painstaking, cross-cultural effort to reassemble what the Watchers transmitted and Enoch preserved, is what the entire history of esoteric knowledge is actually about. Every mystery school, every lineage of initiates, every tradition that claims access to primordial wisdom is making some version of the same claim. We are one of the streams through which the pre-flood knowledge crossed the catastrophe and arrived here, in this moment, available to those prepared to receive it. Whether any of them are right is a separate question, but understanding what they are claiming and why the claim has the specific cosmological shape it has requires understanding everything we have covered about the Watchers, the transmission, the aftermath, and the flood that separated the before from the after. So let's talk about what was actually transmitted, because this is where most treatments of the Watcher tradition go wrong. They focus on the scandal, the transgression, the angels sleeping with human women, the Nephilim, the violence, the chaos that followed. And those elements are real. They are documented across multiple textual traditions, and they matter. But they are not the core of what happened. The core is the knowledge itself. What did the Watchers teach? What was the content of the transmission? And why was that content specifically considered dangerous enough to justify a planetary catastrophe as the response? The Book of Enoch gives us the most systematic account we have, and scholars who work with the Aramaic fragments found at Qumran date the earliest layers of this material to somewhere in the 3rd century BCE, though the traditions it encodes are almost certainly older. What the text describes is not a single teaching event. It is a curriculum, a structured transmission of knowledge across multiple domains, delivered by specific named Watchers, who each carried a specific area of expertise. Azazel, whose name appears in later Jewish ritual as the scapegoat figure, the one who bears accumulated transgression into the wilderness, is described in the Enochic tradition as the transmitter of metallurgy and weapons craft, the working of iron and copper, the shaping of metal into instruments that could cut and pierce and kill at a distance. Alongside this, cosmetics, the art of adorning the body, the use of precious stones, the craft of pigment and color. This pairing is not accidental. Metal and adornment together represent the transformation of raw material reality into something shaped by intelligence and intention. The Watchers taught humanity to impose form on matter. Semyaza, identified in the text as the leader of the descending Watchers, is associated with the transmission of enchantments, what the text calls the cutting of roots, which scholars read as early pharmacology and herbalism, the knowledge of plants as medicines and as mind-altering agents. The boundaries between these categories were not sharp in the ancient world. A plant that healed and a plant that altered perception and a plant that killed were understood as expressing different aspects of a single power. To know the roots was to have access to the hidden potency inside the material world. Other Watchers appear in the lists associated with astrology, the reading of celestial movements as indicators of terrestrial fate, and with meteorology, the interpretation of cloud formations and wind patterns, with the signs of the sun and the moon, with knowledge of what the earth holds inside it, its minerals, its geological structure, with the interpretation of dreams, with the transmission of writing itself in some versions of the tradition. Taken together, what you are looking at is not a random catalogue of forbidden arts. It is a map of a specific kind of power, the power to read hidden structure in the world, to manipulate material reality through knowledge of its underlying patterns, and to shape human consciousness through pharmacological, symbolic, and astronomical means. This is the knowledge that every subsequent mystery tradition claims to be the heir of. This is what the Pythagoreans were preserving when they taught that number underlies reality. This is what the Egyptian priest scholars were encoding in the proportions of their temples. This is what the alchemists were pursuing when they spoke of transmuting base matter into gold. And by gold, they did not mean the metal, or not only the metal. Here is the critical point. The knowledge the Watchers transmitted is not supernatural in the sense of being opposed to nature. It is hypernatural, knowledge of nature's own hidden machinery, the mechanisms behind the surface of things that ordinary perception cannot access without specific training or specific assistance. What made it dangerous, according to the texts, was not that it was evil in itself. Enoch's account is careful about this. The problem was timing. Humanity, in the cosmological framework the texts are working from, was not ready. The transmission happened before the appropriate developmental stage had been reached. It was knowledge given to a species that had not yet cultivated the interior maturity to use it without destroying itself. This is an argument we will need to return to, because it is not simply an ancient mythological claim. It is a structural argument about the relationship between knowledge and the knower, and it appears, in different forms, across every tradition that claims to transmit what the Watchers started. The question of readiness. The question of who receives the knowledge and under what conditions. The entire apparatus of initiation, secrecy, and graduated transmission that characterizes mystery schools from Eleusis to the Hermetic lodges of Renaissance Florence. That apparatus exists as a direct response to the problem the Watcher tradition identifies. Too much, too soon, to those not prepared, produces catastrophe. The flood is the cosmological proof of concept. There is a figure at the center of the Watcher tradition that almost every popular treatment either sensationalizes or ignores entirely. The Nephilim, the offspring of the union between the Watchers and human women. And the reason this figure is so difficult to handle is that the texts themselves are doing something far more complex with it than either the sensationalists or the dismissers recognize. Let's start with the word Nephilim. The etymology is contested among scholars, and that contest is itself revealing. One reading derives the word from the Hebrew root meaning to fall, Nephilim, as the fallen ones, those who descended from a higher register into the material world. Another reading, and this is the one that appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls material, particularly in the Book of Giants, which was recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran, understands Nephilim as the giants, beings of extraordinary physical stature, produced by the crossing of divine and human lineage. The Greek translators of the Hebrew Bible, producing the Septuagint somewhere around the 3rd century BCE, rendered Nephilim as gigantes, which carried both meanings in Greek, not just large beings but earthborn ones, beings whose nature was rooted in the material rather than the celestial. But here is what the texts actually say about what the Nephilim were and what they did. The Book of Enoch describes beings who consumed everything humanity had produced, and then turned to consuming humanity itself. Beings of tremendous appetite, tremendous capacity, tremendous force, without the internal structure to contain or direct any of it. They are, in the cosmological grammar of the tradition, a perfect image of what happens when power is transmitted, without the corresponding development of inner constraint. The Watchers gave knowledge. The union of Watchers and humans produced beings with access to amplified capacity, and the result was consumption without limit. This is not mythology in the pejorative sense, not a story that primitive people told because they lacked scientific understanding. This is a structural argument dressed in narrative form, and the structure of the argument is precise. You take a being whose nature is oriented toward the material and the appetitive. You infuse that being with amplified power and capacity, without a corresponding deepening of interior orientation, without what the later Gnostic traditions would call pneumatic development, without what the Hermetic traditions would call the cultivation of nous. What you produce is not elevated humanity. What you produce is humanity with the brakes removed. The Nephilim, in this reading, are not monsters. They are a demonstration. They show what the pre-transmission human capacity, scaled up without inner transformation, actually looks like at full power. and the demonstration is catastrophic because it is recognizable. You do not need ancient mythological literacy to understand the pattern the texts are describing. You need only look at the history of civilizations that gained access to powerful technologies, whether metallurgical, chemical, nuclear, or informational, without a corresponding development of the interior discipline required to use those technologies wisely. The tradition is not condemning power. It is not condemning knowledge. It is making a specific and sophisticated claim about the relationship between outer capacity and inner development, and it is using the Nephilim as the concrete image of what the gap between those two things produces. Now here is where the tradition gets genuinely complex, and where most treatments simply stop, because the Book of Giants, the Qumran text that expands the Nephilim narrative significantly beyond what appears in the canonical Enoch, does not present the Nephilim as simply destructive. It presents specific Nephilim figures, particularly Mahaway, as recipients of prophetic dreams, as beings capable of receiving cosmological communication, as figures who could go to Enoch himself to receive interpretation of those dreams. This matters enormously, because it means the tradition is not drawing a simple line between angelic and human, and Nephilim, as three distinct ontological categories with fixed moral valences. It is describing a more fluid situation, in which even the beings who represent the problem of uncontained power still have access, partial, troubled, but real, to the kind of interior perception that the Watcher's knowledge was meant to cultivate. The Nephilim sought interpretation. They went to the one human who had cultivated genuine interior development. They brought their dreams to Enoch. And Enoch's response, as preserved in the Qumran fragments, is not rejection, it is engagement. He tells them what their dreams mean. And what they mean is, the flood is coming, the current order cannot hold, and what is built on the wrong foundation will be destroyed. This is the transmission within the catastrophe. Even at the moment of the system's collapse, even within the beings who most fully embody the problem the system has created, there is the capacity to receive the message. The knowledge does not abandon even those it has been most destructive through. It delivers its final communication. This is what went wrong, and this is what is coming. Every tradition we are examining in this narrative has a singular figure at its center. Not the fallen ones, not the giants, not the watchers who descended, but the one human who moved in the opposite direction. Enoch ben Jared, the seventh patriarch from Adam in the Genesis genealogy, the one figure in that entire list who does not simply live and die. The text says he walked with God and was not, for God took him. 17 words in the Hebrew that have generated 2,000 years of interpretation, because they describe something the rest of the genealogy does not. A human being who did not die. A human being who crossed in the other direction. And what was Enoch doing while the watchers were descending? According to the tradition that accumulated around him, the first book of Enoch, the second book of Enoch recovered in Slavonic manuscripts, the third book of Enoch, which belongs to the Merkabah mystical tradition and dates to somewhere in the 5th or 6th century CE, Enoch was ascending. He was learning, not from the watchers who came down to humanity's level, but from the celestial councils themselves. He was taken up through layer after layer of the cosmological structure that sits above the material world, and shown what the architecture of reality actually looks like from above. This is the counter-transmission, and its shape is precisely the inverse of the Watcher's transmission. The Watchers brought celestial knowledge downward, into matter, prematurely. Enoch was taken upward, out of matter, through a process of graduated initiation, each level of the ascent corresponding to a deepening of interior capacity. He did not simply receive information. He was transformed by the journey. By the time the first book of Enoch describes him standing before the throne of the Ancient of Days, Enoch is no longer the figure who left the earth. He has become something else through the process of ascent itself. The second book of Enoch is extraordinarily specific about this. The archangel Veravail, who does not appear in the canonical texts at all and survives only in this Slavonic tradition, dictates to Enoch for 30 days and 30 nights, 360 books. The entire contents of the celestial archive, every astronomical pattern, every cosmological structure, every account of creation and destruction, and the mechanisms underlying the material world. Enoch writes it all down, and here is the critical detail. He is then instructed to go back, to return to the earth for 30 days, to transmit what he has received to his sons and to those prepared to hear it, and then to be taken permanently. This instruction to return is not incidental. It is the structural hinge of the entire tradition. The ascent of Enoch is not only about Enoch, it is about what Enoch carries back. The celestial knowledge, the genuine, undistorted, properly sequenced knowledge of the cosmological architecture, needs a human carrier. It needs to enter the human record. And it needs to do so through a figure who has been properly prepared, who has undergone the interior transformation that the Watcher's pupils never underwent. Not knowledge delivered from outside to an unprepared recipient. Knowledge received by a being who has been made capable of receiving it through the process of ascent itself. This is why Enoch matters to every tradition that comes after. The Hermetic corpus, assembled in Alexandria somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, presents Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, as a figure who received celestial knowledge and transmitted it to humanity in written form. The structure is identical to the Enoch tradition, and scholars have debated for over a century whether the Hermetic Enoch and the Egyptian Hermes are the same underlying figure, processed through different cultural vocabularies. The Merkabah mystics of early Jewish esotericism built their entire practice around the technology of celestial ascent, the chariot of Ezekiel, as a vehicle for exactly the kind of journey Enoch took. The Islamic tradition preserves Enoch as Idris, the one who was raised to a high station, the prophet of writing and of astronomical knowledge. And the Gnostic traditions, the ones we have covered extensively in previous videos on this channel, the Sethian and Valentinian frameworks that describe the soul's navigation through the archontic layers back toward the pleroma, are structurally a version of the same movement. The knowledge of the ascent path, the map of the celestial architecture, the understanding of what each layer is, what it demands, how to pass through it. This is Enochic knowledge, reformulated in a different cosmological vocabulary. Enoch crossed before the flood. He carried the knowledge of the crossing upward. And what he transmitted to his sons before he was permanently taken, what the tradition insists he encoded, preserved, handed forward, is the map that every subsequent tradition claiming primordial wisdom claims to be working from. Not a map of the material world, a map of the path out of it. This is what was at stake. This is why the tradition treats Enoch not as a curiosity in a genealogy, but as the pivot of human spiritual history. The flood narrative appears in more ancient textual traditions than almost any other single mythological event. Mesopotamian accounts, the Atrahasis epic, the Gilgamesh epic, the Eridu Genesis, all describe a divine council decision to destroy humanity through water, a single righteous individual warned in advance, the building of a vessel, the survival of a remnant, and the world beginning again after the waters recede. The Hebrew Genesis account follows this same structural template so closely that scholars like Jeffrey Tigay and Andrew George, working with the Mesopotamian source texts, have mapped the correspondences in meticulous detail. The story is not unique to any single tradition. It appears to be something that many ancient civilizations, working from independent cultural starting points, converged on as a description of a singular event. But the Watcher tradition uses the flood differently from how the Genesis account uses it, and that difference is the key to understanding what is actually being claimed. In the Genesis account, the flood is primarily a moral event, God's response to human wickedness, Noah's righteousness as the basis for his survival, the covenant after the waters as a new beginning for the human relationship with the divine. The moral framework is clear, and the flood is primarily a story about sin, judgment, and renewal. In the Enochic tradition, the flood is a cosmological event. It is the response to a specific structural disruption in the relationship between celestial and terrestrial orders. Not simply human wickedness in the generic sense, but the specific problem of premature and distorted transmission. The Watchers broke the boundaries between orders of being that were meant to remain distinct, until humanity had developed the capacity to interface with celestial knowledge without being destroyed by it. The Nephilim are the product of that boundary violation, operating at full scale, and the flood is what restores the boundary. This distinction matters because it changes what the flood destroys and what it is meant to preserve. In the moral framework, the flood destroys the wicked and preserves the righteous. In the cosmological framework, the flood destroys a world that has been structurally compromised, a world in which the premature transmission has become so embedded in the fabric of civilization that the civilization itself has become incompatible with the continued development of human consciousness. And what is preserved is not simply the righteous individual. What is preserved is the knowledge, the map, the encoded transmission that Enoch carried before he ascended. The tradition is explicit about this. Jubilees, the 2nd century BCE retelling of Genesis that preserves extensive Enochic material, states that Enoch wrote his book specifically so that the knowledge would survive the catastrophe. The tradition of Noah's sons receiving written or oral transmissions from their father that ultimately derive from Enoch appears in multiple texts. The fragment of pre-flood knowledge that crosses the boundary of the catastrophe and arrives in the post-flood world is, in the cosmological reading, the entire point of what Noah preserves. Not simply genetic survival, epistemological survival. The knowledge of the world before survives because it was encoded before the destruction came. Now here is what this means for everything that comes after. Every civilization that arose after the flood, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley cultures, the earliest layers of what would become China's classical tradition, encountered the world in a specific condition. The Watchers were gone, the Nephilim were gone. The direct interface between human and celestial intelligence that had characterized the pre-flood world was severed, but the knowledge was not gone. It had crossed. It had survived in whatever form Enoch encoded it, whatever Noah transmitted, whatever the righteous remnant carried through the catastrophe into the after. And this is precisely why the mystery traditions that arose in these post-flood civilizations have the character they have. They are not inventing new knowledge from scratch. They are claiming to be recovering, preserving, or transmitting something that came from before. The Egyptian priests who maintained that their sacred sciences derived from Thoth, who had taught humanity at the beginning of time. This is the Enoch tradition in Egyptian vocabulary. The Sumerian king lists that describe antediluvian kings ruling for impossibly long periods before the flood, with clearly shorter lifespans after. This is the same structural claim, that something about the pre-flood world was qualitatively different from what came after. The flood is the great divide. Before, direct transmission, open interface between celestial and human intelligence, knowledge given whole and clear, even if prematurely. After, fragmentary recovery, indirect access, knowledge preserved in encoding that requires initiated understanding to unlock. The mystery schools are the decoding institutions. They exist because the flood created a world in which the knowledge can no longer be received directly. It can only be recovered, layer by layer, through a process of interior development that mirrors, in miniature, the ascent of Enoch himself. This is not a small claim. It is the claim that the entire architecture of human esoteric tradition rests on a specific cosmological event, that the event was real in some sense the tradition insists on, and that the knowledge scattered by that event is what every serious lineage of wisdom transmission is ultimately in pursuit of. The Watchers brought it down, the flood dispersed it, Enoch encoded it, and everything since has been the long work of recovery. Recovery is not random. That is the first thing to understand about what happened after the flood, after the dispersal, after Enoch encoded what remained. Recovery has a structure, and that structure follows the original structure of the Watchers themselves, because the knowledge that was scattered bore the shape of the minds that originally carried it. The Watchers were not a uniform group. This is one of the most overlooked facts in the entire tradition, and it matters enormously for understanding what was lost and what was preserved. The Book of Enoch is explicit about this. There was a hierarchy, there were leaders, and there were subordinates. There were those whose primary domain was celestial mechanics, the movements of stars, the calculation of sacred time, and there were those whose domain was the biology of living things, the properties of plants, the architecture of metals, the hidden properties of sound and speech. Different watchers carried different portions of an integrated system of knowledge, and when they fell, they did not fall as a single unified body. They fell according to their nature. The leader of the descent is named in the tradition as Shemyaza, sometimes rendered Semjaza. He is the one who extracted the oath from the other watchers on the summit of Mount Hermon, a detail the text is precise about. Mount Hermon, not a metaphorical mountain, a specific geographic location in what is now the border region between modern Lebanon and Syria, a site that ancient texts from multiple traditions mark as a threshold, a crossing point, a place where the boundary between what is above and what is below was thinner than elsewhere. Shemyaza understood what they were about to do. He knew it was transgression, and so before they descended he bound the others to the agreement with an oath, because he did not want to be the only one who bore the consequence if they were judged for it. This detail is important. It reveals something about the moral architecture of the Watchers that is almost never discussed. Shemyaza was not reckless. He was calculating. He assessed the risk, he distributed it, and he proceeded. This is not the behavior of a being consumed by simple lust, which is the reading the tradition has been collapsed into by interpreters who found the more complex version inconvenient. Shemyaza understood transgression as a collective act with collective consequences. He organized it accordingly. Then there is Azazel. Where Shemyaza is the organizer of the descent, Azazel is named in the tradition as the one who bore the deepest guilt for what followed. The Book of Enoch draws a sharp distinction between the two. Shemyaza's transgression was the act of descent itself, the crossing of the boundary. Azazel's transgression was the transmission, specifically the transmission of what the text calls the eternal secrets, the knowledge that was not supposed to reach material humanity at that stage of its development. Azazel taught the making of weapons. He taught the working of metals. He taught the art of seduction through ornamentation, the use of cosmetics and jewelry and decoration to alter social perception. And according to the tradition, he taught something far more consequential than any of those. He transmitted the underlying principles that make those specific skills possible, which is to say, he taught the relationship between invisible causes and visible effects. The distinction the text draws is precise. Other watchers taught skills. Azazel taught the architecture beneath the skills. This is why his name, in the ritual of the scapegoat described in Leviticus, carries the full weight of collective guilt. He is not guilty of one transgression. He is guilty of the structural transmission, the opening of a channel that, once opened, could not be closed. Beneath Shemyaza and Azazel, the tradition lists 19 additional leaders, each associated with a specific domain of knowledge. Amaros taught the resolution of enchantments, the ability to unravel what had been bound by formula. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabel taught the signs of the stars. Zakiel taught the knowledge of clouds and weather. Sariel taught the movements of the moon. Penemue taught the bitter and the sweet, which the tradition interprets as the knowledge of writing, of distinguishing between what should be recorded and what should not. That last detail is extraordinary, and it is almost always overlooked. Penemue's domain was writing itself, not the mechanics of inscription but the discernment required to use writing rightly, the knowledge of what knowledge is fit to be fixed in permanent form and what should remain oral and therefore living. When Penemue transmitted this to humanity prematurely, the tradition is saying something specific, that the problem of writing is not technical, it is cosmological. The ability to fix knowledge in a form that outlasts its context is not a neutral skill. It is a power that changes what knowledge is. Every serious reader of this tradition eventually reaches the same problem. The Watchers descended. They took wives from among human women. And from those unions came the Nephilim, giants, in the most common translation. This is where the text loses most of its readers, either into literalism, which produces one set of impossible conclusions, or into pure allegory, which dissolves the specificity of the tradition into something so abstract it carries no weight at all. There is a third reading. It is the one the tradition itself supplies, if you follow it carefully. The Nephilim were not simply large humans. They were not, in the Gnostic and Hermetic reception of this tradition, physical giants in the straightforward sense. What the tradition is describing is a category of being that does not map cleanly onto either the celestial or the human. The word Nephilim itself carries the root of falling. They are, etymologically, the fallen ones, or the ones produced by falling. They are the consequence of boundary violation made flesh, and the tradition is consistent across multiple sources in describing what they became: insatiable, destructive, unable to find satisfaction in any earthly substance, consuming resources faster than the earth could replenish them. The Book of Enoch describes this in concrete terms. The Nephilim first consumed all the food humanity had produced. Then they turned to consuming humanity itself. Then they turned on each other. Then they turned inward. And this is the detail that the tradition preserves but almost never explains. They began to sin against birds, against beasts, against reptiles, against fish. This language, read literally, produces something absurd. Read through the cosmological lens the tradition is actually using, it describes something coherent. Beings whose hunger was cosmological in origin, whose need was not for physical sustenance, but for a kind of energetic replenishment that the material world was structurally incapable of providing, and who therefore consumed everything in proximity, in increasingly desperate attempts to fill a need that could not be filled from below. This is the Nephilim problem in its real form. They were not evil in the conventional sense. They were structurally misaligned, produced by a union between two orders of being whose natures were not designed to merge, carrying in their bodies the tension of that incompatibility. They could not ascend because they were partially material. They could not be satisfied by matter because they were partially celestial. They were trapped in the exact boundary space the Watchers had transgressed to create them. The ancient Near Eastern traditions surrounding the Nephilim are consistent on this point in ways that are rarely assembled together. The Sumerian king lists, which scholars have noted contain lifespans that mirror the antediluvian figures in Genesis, are describing the same category of being, rulers whose connection to the celestial order is what legitimizes their governance, but whose material embodiment is what makes their rule unstable and ultimately catastrophic. Gilgamesh himself, in the Babylonian tradition, is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a ratio that functions as a mythological notation for the same structural problem the Nephilim represent. He is too divine to be satisfied by mortal existence, too mortal to access what his divine nature requires. His entire epic is the story of what happens to a being caught in that threshold. The Gnostic tradition received this framework and processed it through its own cosmological system. For the Gnostic interpreters, the Nephilim were not a historical curiosity. They were a demonstration of what happens when beings from one level of the hierarchy attempt to generate life at another level without the proper alignment. The Watchers did not have the authority to create new categories of being. That authority belongs to what the tradition calls the higher powers, and the Watchers, in attempting to replicate the generative act at a level they were not authorized to operate at, produced something that was constitutionally broken from its first moment. This maps precisely onto the Gnostic understanding of the demiurge's creation of material humanity. The demiurge creates humanity out of materials and with capacities that the demiurge did not design and does not fully understand, because the demiurge is working with a partial and distorted image of what humanity is supposed to be. The result in both cases is the same: a being that carries something from a higher order, but is embedded in conditions that prevent that higher inheritance from functioning as it was meant to. The Nephilim and the human being, in the deepest Gnostic reading of this tradition, are not opposites. They are versions of the same problem at different scales. And this is why the flood does not simply destroy the Nephilim as punishment. The flood resets the conditions. It is not retributive justice. It is a structural correction, an attempt to close the gap that the Watchers opened by returning the material world to a state in which the boundary between levels is more firmly re-established. Before the flood, before the judgment, before the Watchers were bound and cast into the darkness beneath the earth that the tradition calls Tartarus, and before the Nephilim were destroyed in the wars they fought against each other and against what remained of original humanity. Before all of that, Enoch walked with God. That phrase is in Genesis, 3 words in the Hebrew, Vayithalech Hanoch et ha-Elohim. And then the text says, he was not, because God took him. No death recorded, no burial, no genealogical closure of the kind the text provides for every other figure in the antediluvian list. Enoch simply ceases to be present in the material world. The tradition has been wrestling with that absence for millennia. The Book of Enoch fills the gap. And what it describes is not a passive assumption into the divine presence. It is an active ascent, a guided journey through the layers of the cosmos, conducted by the angel Uriel, in which Enoch is shown the architecture of the created order from the inside. He is shown the storehouses of snow and hail. He is shown the chambers where the winds originate. He is shown the mountain at the ends of the earth, the tree whose fragrance is incomparable, the river of fire, the prison where the disobedient stars are bound. He is shown the place where the souls of the dead wait. He is shown the throne, the structure around the throne, the concentric rings of fire and light that constitute what later traditions will call the Merkava, the chariot, but which Enoch experiences not as a theological concept, but as a literal traversal. And then, and this is the moment the tradition builds toward, Enoch is brought before the presence at the center. He sees, or attempts to see, the source itself. And the text records something that almost every commentator has rushed past, because it is so unusual. Enoch falls on his face, not in worship, though worship is part of it. He falls because he cannot remain upright in that proximity. His body, his human material form, cannot maintain its orientation in the presence of what the tradition calls the great glory. Uriel lifts him, and then, in a passage that 3 Enoch, the much later Merkava text, develops at extraordinary length, Enoch is transformed. The tradition calls the transformed being Metatron. He is given a throne beside the divine throne. He is crowned. He is given dominion over the angelic orders. He is, in a word, no longer the human who began the ascent. He has been elevated to a position that is, functionally, angelic, or more than angelic. This transformation is not incidental to the tradition. It is its central claim. The claim is that a human being, a being embedded in material existence, descended from Adam, made of dust, can, through a specific process of interior alignment and guided ascent, traverse the layers of the cosmos and arrive at a state of being that is structurally different from the one it began in. Not metaphorically different, not spiritually different in the sense of feeling more peaceful, ontologically different, different in what it is. The Gnostic tradition received this claim and understood it as the template for what the pneumatic soul, the soul that carries the divine spark, is ultimately in pursuit of. Not salvation in the conventional sense, not forgiveness of moral transgression, but the recovery of a mode of being that material existence has temporarily obscured. Enoch's ascent is the first documented example of what the tradition calls anamnesis, unforgetting. He does not learn the architecture of the cosmos during his ascent. He remembers it. The distinction is the entire point. Learning implies an exterior source, transmitting information to a receiver who did not previously possess it. Remembering implies that the information was always present in the receiver, but had become inaccessible. Enoch's journey is not an education, it is a return. The texts that circulate under Enoch's name are, by this reading, not records of what Enoch was told. They are records of what he recovered in the act of remembering, and then encoded in the knowledge that the flood was coming, in the form that could survive the dispersal. 2 columns, stone for the flood, brick for the fire. The architecture of the cosmos, written in materials chosen to outlast the destruction of the world that received the original transmission. This is why every serious mystical tradition that traces its lineage back through the ancient Near East treats the figure of Enoch with a weight that seems, from the outside, disproportionate to his brief appearance in the canonical text. He is not important because of what happened to him. He is important because of what he demonstrated, that the ascent is possible, that the architecture can be traversed, that a human being carrying the divine spark can recover, through that traversal, the knowledge of what it actually is. Here is something the standard telling of this history almost always omits. The knowledge the Watchers brought down, and the knowledge Enoch encoded, did not survive as a single unified tradition. It split, almost immediately. And the two streams that resulted from that split have different properties, different vulnerabilities, and different relationships to the material world, that is the prison, or the school, depending on which tradition you are standing in. The written tradition is the one most people encounter first, because writing is what survives in archives and libraries and the collections of universities. The texts bearing Enoch's name, the fragments of the Book of Giants recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Hermetic corpus, which preserves the same cosmological framework in a Hellenistic form, the Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945 in a sealed jar near the Egyptian city of Luxor, which gave the modern world its first direct access to Gnostic texts that the early church had spent centuries attempting to destroy. These are the written carriers of the tradition, and they are extraordinary, but they are also, by the logic of the tradition itself, incomplete. Penemue, remember, the watcher whose domain was writing, whose specific transmission was the knowledge of what should be recorded and what should not. The tradition is saying, through the figure of Penemue, that the act of writing is a selective act, that the decision to fix knowledge in permanent form is itself a cosmological decision with consequences. What gets written can be found by the wrong hands. What gets written can be misread by those who lack the interior development to receive it. What gets written can be burned, which is why the early church burned what it could find, and confiscated what it could not burn, and declared possession of what it could not confiscate, punishable by death. The oral tradition survived precisely because it could not be burned. It lived in the memory of initiated individuals who passed it to other initiated individuals through direct transmission, not through texts but through practice, through guided experience, through the kind of encounter that the Merkava mystics called the descent to the chariot, which, despite the word descent, was in fact an interior ascent toward the same architecture Enoch had traversed externally. The oral tradition is what generated the Kabbalistic system, which is not, as popular presentation often implies, derived primarily from written sources. The Zohar, the central written text of Kabbalah, was composed in 13th century Spain, but the tradition it systematizes, claims, and serious scholars do not dismiss this claim, a transmission lineage that predates the written form by many centuries. The same is true of the Hermetic oral tradition. The texts that survive under the name Hermes Trismegistus, the Corpus Hermeticum, the Asclepius, the fragments preserved in Stobaeus, are written crystallizations of a transmission that was primarily oral. The god Thoth, who is the Egyptian analogue of the figure the Greeks called Hermes Trismegistus, is the deity of writing in the Egyptian system. But the paradox at the heart of the Thoth tradition is that Thoth, as deity of writing, is simultaneously the keeper of secrets that cannot be written, the one who records what is known and guards what cannot be recorded. This is the same paradox the Penemue tradition articulates. Writing is the preservation of knowledge and simultaneously the boundary of what knowledge can be preserved. For the Gnostic tradition specifically, the relationship between written and oral transmission became a survival question after the imperial church began its systematic suppression in the 4th century. What could be written was written, and then hidden, which is what the Nag Hammadi community did when they sealed their library in a jar and buried it near a cliff face, knowing or sensing that the texts would otherwise be destroyed. What could not be safely written was carried forward in the practices of lineages that the church could not fully identify or reach. In the wandering teachers, the tradition called pneumatics, in the communities that preserved Hermetic practice under the cover of alchemical language, in the initiatic transmission that moved through the medieval period, in forms that the institution could occasionally suppress locally but could never extinguish entirely. This is the situation that every serious student of this material is actually inheriting. Not a single tradition with a clean lineage, but two streams, written and oral, that have different shapes, different gaps, and different relationships to what they are ultimately attempting to transmit. The written stream gives you the architecture. The oral stream, where it can still be accessed, gives you the method. Neither is complete without the other, and both, if the tradition is right about what they contain, are carriers of the same original transmission, the knowledge the Watchers brought down, that Enoch encoded, that the flood dispersed, that everything since has been the long and imperfect work of recovering. So let's be precise about what the Watchers actually were, according to the oldest layer of the tradition. Not angels who broke a rule, not demons who fell from grace, not symbols of human desire getting out of hand. Those readings all came later, filtered through institutions that needed the story to serve a different purpose. The earliest stratum of the tradition, the material preserved in 1 Enoch, in fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Book of Giants, and in textual echoes scattered across Second Temple Jewish literature, describes something considerably more specific. The Watchers were a class of being whose primary function was observation. The name itself is the description. They watched, they perceived, they had a relationship to awareness itself that was different in kind, not just degree, from what human beings possessed at the time of their arrival. This matters, because the intervention the tradition describes is not primarily a physical intervention. The Watchers did not simply teach humanity how to smelt metal or apply cosmetics. Those details appear in the text, yes. But the deeper layer, the layer that keeps surfacing across traditions that have no obvious contact with each other, is that the Watchers transmitted something about the nature of perception itself. They transmitted awareness of awareness, the capacity to not just experience the world, but to know that you are experiencing it, to step back from the stream of sensation and recognize yourself as the one who is observing. This is what the Gnostic tradition will later call gnosis. The Hermetic tradition calls it the nous. The Vedic tradition calls it the witness consciousness. The Buddhist tradition circles around it from 100 different angles. The names change. The underlying thing they are pointing at is structurally identical. And if the Watcher tradition is read carefully, this is precisely what they transferred. Not information about the external world, though that came with it, but a specific quality of inner perception that human beings either did not have before or had in a dormant, undeveloped form. The Apocryphon of John, a Scythian Gnostic text discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945 and dated by scholars to somewhere between the late 1st and early 3rd century CE, contains what is almost certainly a transformation of this same core event. In its version of the creation narrative, the Archons, the false divine administrators who govern the material world, create a human form that is inert. It has structure, it has shape, but it does not move, it does not perceive, it cannot stand. What animates the human form is not the Archons. The Archons do not have the capacity to give life. What animates it is a light that descends into the material construct from the higher realms, a spark of authentic divine consciousness that gets embedded in matter and becomes the interior life of the human being. Now, hold that image next to the Watcher tradition. In the Enochic material, humanity exists but is, in some sense, incomplete, lacking, operating below a threshold. The Watchers descend, they transmit, and after the transmission, something fundamentally different is true about human beings. These are not the same story told with different names, but they are pointing at the same structural event from two different angles. One tradition describes the mechanism from the outside. Beings descended, transmission occurred. The other describes it from the inside. A spark of higher consciousness became embedded in the material form and became its animating principle. Both traditions agree on the essential thing, that what makes human beings what they are is not native to the material order. It came from somewhere else. It arrived. It was placed here, or it descended here, or it was transmitted here. The traditions differ on the agency and the mechanism, but they converge completely on the conclusion that the human interior carries something that the material world did not generate and cannot fully contain. This is the claim that every downstream tradition is essentially trying to manage. Some traditions celebrate it. Some traditions are terrified by it. Some traditions, and this is the institutional pattern that repeats across Christianity, across certain strands of Judaism, across Orthodox Islam, work very hard to ensure that human beings never fully understand what it means. Because if you understand what it means, if you actually absorb the implication, then the entire architecture of external religious authority starts to dissolve. You do not need a mediator between yourself and the divine if the divine is already what you fundamentally are? You do not need an institution to manage your salvation if what you carry inside you is a direct fragment of the source. This is why the Watcher tradition was suppressed. Not because it was mythologically inconvenient, because it was institutionally catastrophic. The Book of Watchers, preserved in 1 Enoch chapters 6 through 36, and among the oldest sections of the entire Enochic corpus, contains a detailed list, a curriculum essentially. The specific knowledge that specific Watchers transmitted to specific human recipients. This list has been used for centuries to argue that the Watchers were malevolent, that the knowledge they transmitted was corrupting, that the result of their intervention was violence, warfare, moral collapse, and the production of the Nephilim, the giants whose existence made the flood narratively necessary. That reading is real, it is present in the text, but it is not the only reading available, and there is a compelling case that it is not the primary reading, that it is in fact a later interpretive overlay placed on top of an older tradition that understood the Watcher curriculum very differently. Here is what the text actually records. Asael, one of the primary Watcher figures, sometimes rendered Azazel, taught the making of weapons, the working of metals, and, crucially, the crafting of adornments, jewelry, cosmetics, the art of enhancing physical appearance. Shemihaza and his group taught enchantments and root cuttings, pharmacological and magical knowledge. Other named Watchers transmitted knowledge of astrology, the movements of celestial bodies, cloud reading, earth reading, sign reading. The orthodox interpretation treats this list as a catalogue of corruptions. The weapons led to war. The adornments led to vanity and sexual transgression. The magical knowledge led to sorcery. The astronomical knowledge was misused for divination. But step back from the moral framing and look at the structure of the list itself. What you have is a systematic transmission of knowledge about the properties of matter and how to work with it, the properties of living systems and how to influence them, and the properties of time and celestial motion and how to read them. This is not a random list. This is a complete epistemological map. Matter, life, time, the three fundamental categories of material existence, each with a corresponding mode of knowledge, each transmitted by a specific class of Watcher. The Hermetic texts, particularly the Corpus Hermeticum, compiled in its current form somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, but drawing on traditions that are considerably older, organize their understanding of reality in almost exactly the same three registers. The knowledge of material transformation, which the Hermeticists called alchemy in its later development. The knowledge of living systems and their animation, which they connected to pneuma and to what they understood as the vital principle. And the knowledge of celestial mechanics, which for the Hermeticists was not simply astronomy, but was the key to understanding how higher-order reality structures express themselves in the patterns of the material world. The Watcher curriculum and the Hermetic curriculum are not identical, but they share an identical underlying logic, that the material world is legible, that it has a structure that can be learned, and that learning that structure gives the one who learns it a form of power that operates outside the normal constraints of material existence. Now here is the part that never makes it into the standard religious education. The text of 1 Enoch does not actually say that this knowledge was bad in itself. What it says, and this is a critical distinction, is that the timing was wrong and the context was wrong. The knowledge was given before humanity was ready to integrate it. It was given outside the proper channels of transmission. It was given in a way that bypassed the developmental sequence through which human beings were supposed to arrive at it naturally. This is precisely the Gnostic understanding of the Archons' intervention as well. The Archons do not create something from nothing. They cannot. They take material from higher levels of reality and reconfigure it in ways that produce a distorted copy. The problem is not the raw material. The raw material is divine. The problem is what happens to it when it passes through a consciousness that does not understand what it is handling. The Watchers, in one reading of the tradition, made the same error. Not an evil error, an error of proportion, of sequence, of readiness. They transmitted authentic divine knowledge through a channel, direct physical transmission to embodied human beings, that produced a distortion, not because the knowledge was corrupt, but because the receiving system was not yet configured to hold it, without that distortion occurring. The flood, in this reading, is not punishment, it is a reset. A necessary correction to a developmental sequence that had been accelerated past the point where integration was possible. And what survives the flood, what Enoch carries forward in his books, what Noah preserves in his own transmitted knowledge, is the same curriculum, but now structured differently, encoded rather than transmitted directly, preserved for a later point in the sequence when it might be received without the same catastrophic distortion. Enoch is the pivot point. You cannot understand what the Watcher tradition is actually about without understanding what Enoch's role in it is. And the tradition is very specific about that role, in ways that are almost never discussed in mainstream treatments of the material. The standard presentation goes like this. Enoch was a righteous man who walked with God and was taken up into heaven without dying. Genesis gives him 7 verses. He appears briefly, lives 365 years, a number that is almost certainly not coincidental given its correspondence to the solar year. And then he is gone. God took him. The text offers no further explanation, but the Enochic tradition is not 7 verses. It is an entire library. The first book of Enoch alone is longer than most of the canonical Old Testament books. The second book of Enoch, the Slavonic Enoch, takes the cosmological architecture even further. The third book of Enoch, preserved in Jewish mystical literature, transforms Enoch into the angelic figure Metatron, who sits at the right hand of the divine and serves as the celestial scribe. Across all of these versions, Enoch's function is consistent. He is the bridge. He is the figure who moves between the angelic realm and the human realm without being destroyed by the transition. He receives knowledge from above and carries it below. He is taken above and returns, or, in the final version of the tradition, he is taken above and does not return in human form, but his books do. His books. This is the detail that the entire tradition hangs on. Enoch does not simply experience visions. He writes, he records, he systematically encodes what he has been shown into a textual format that can survive his departure from the human realm and continue to function as a transmission vehicle after he is gone. The second book of Enoch is particularly explicit about this. In that text, Enoch is given a period of 30 days to return to earth before his final ascension. He uses that 30 days to call his children together, to transmit what he knows orally, and to give them his books. He instructs them explicitly, preserve these books. Pass them to your children. Do not let them be lost, because what they contain is not my personal insight. What they contain is what I was shown from above, and it will be needed. This is not a minor narrative detail. This is a complete theory of what written sacred text is for and how it functions. The text is not valued because of the person who wrote it. The text is valued because of what passed through the person who wrote it. Enoch is a conduit. His books are the fixed material record of a transmission that could not otherwise survive in the material world. Now hold that against what we know about the relationship between the Watchers and the flood. The Watchers transmitted directly, embodied transmission, face to face, angel to human. That transmission produced the Nephilim, the violence, the corruption the tradition describes. It was too much, too fast, without the proper encoding. Enoch's transmission works differently. It goes through the mediation of writing. It goes through the structure of a text that can be read, reread, interpreted, misread, argued over, and slowly unpacked across generations. The directness is removed. The overwhelming immediacy of direct angelic transmission is filtered through the necessarily slower and more structured medium of written language. This is why the tradition presents Enoch as a corrective to the Watcher catastrophe, rather than simply a continuation of it. The Watchers gave too much at once, with too little structure. Enoch gives the same essential content, the knowledge of celestial mechanics, of the nature of the angelic orders, of the structure of the heavens, and the logic of the divine, but in a form that requires the human recipient to do the work of unpacking it. The knowledge is still there, but it is encoded now. It is protected by its own structure. The Hermetic tradition understood this perfectly. The Corpus Hermeticum opens with the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. receiving a direct vision from the divine intellect, and then immediately encoding that vision into a written and oral teaching that he transmits to his students. The parallel structure to Enoch is not accidental. Both figures stand at the same threshold. Both receive from above and transmit below. Both use the written text as the vehicle that carries the transmission forward through time. And both traditions agree on the same fundamental point, that this encoding was necessary because the direct version, the unmediated transmission, was not survivable by human beings in their current condition. The text is not a consolation prize for people who cannot receive direct transmission. The text is the appropriate form for this stage of the developmental sequence. It is what the material is supposed to look like from this side of the threshold. Enoch knew this. The tradition says he was shown everything: the structure of the heavens, the names and functions of the angelic orders, the logic of time and celestial motion, the nature of the divine itself. And his response to being shown all of this was not to attempt to transmit it all directly. It was to write it down in a form that other human beings could approach slowly, carefully, and on the schedule their own development permitted. That is not a small thing. That is, if you follow the logic of this tradition all the way through, an act of profound precision. And it is the act that made everything that came after, the Hermetic lineage, the Gnostic texts, the Jewish mystical tradition, the entire architecture of what we are discussing right now, possible. The Nephilim. You cannot go far into this material without running directly into them, and the way you understand the Nephilim is almost a perfect diagnostic for where you are in your engagement with the tradition as a whole. The shallow reading is well known. Angels had sex with human women. The offspring were giants. The giants were violent and destructive. God sent the flood to destroy them. The end. That reading is not wrong exactly. Those elements are present in the text. But it is the equivalent of reading the Apocryphon of John and concluding that it is a story about a man who had a vision. Technically accurate, missing everything that matters. The word Nephilim itself is the first key. It appears in Genesis 6:4 and again in Numbers 13:33. The etymology is contested, has been contested for centuries, among scholars who have devoted serious attention to it. The most straightforward derivation connects it to the Hebrew root nephil, naphal, which means to fall. The Nephilim are, in this reading, the fallen ones, not giants, fallen ones. The tradition of reading them as giants comes primarily from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, which renders Nephilim as gigantes, and from the passage in Numbers where the Israelite spies report back that the inhabitants of Canaan made them feel like grasshoppers by comparison. But here is what the scholarly consensus now largely accepts. The gigantes reading is a late interpretive move. The original referent of Nephilim in the tradition of 1 Enoch and in the oldest Semitic sources is not physical size. It is ontological status. The Nephilim are the ones who have fallen, or more precisely, whose origin is the fall. They are the product of a crossing between two levels of reality that were not supposed to intersect directly. The Book of Giants, a fragmentary text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and now understood to be part of the same Enochic literary tradition, presents the Nephilim not primarily as physical giants, but as beings in a specific kind of existential crisis. They are trapped between two natures. They have the heritage of the Watchers, the divine awareness, the capacity for higher perception, and they have the heritage of material human embodiment. They cannot fully occupy either register. They cannot ascend because they are too embodied. They cannot be fully human because their consciousness has a range that normal human existence cannot contain. The violence that the tradition attributes to the Nephilim, the warfare, the consumption, the destruction, is legible in this frame not as evil for its own sake, but as the behavioral signature of a being that is fundamentally misaligned with its own existence. They are not at home anywhere. They have no proper context in which their nature makes sense, and the result of that irresolvable internal tension is what the text describes, a kind of compulsive, expansive destructiveness that cannot be satisfied, because what it is actually seeking, resolution of the ontological crisis at its core, cannot be found through any material action. Now read the Gnostic anthropology against this background. The Gnostic tradition holds that human beings in their current condition are, in a structural sense, exactly what the Nephilim were. Not evil, not fallen in the sense of having sinned, but caught between two natures that pull in opposite directions. There is the divine spark, the pneuma, the fragment of the pleroma that descended into material embodiment and powers the interior life. And there is the hyle, the material body with its appetites, its drives, its complete investment in the logic of the material world. The human being in Gnostic understanding is not a simple creature, it is a composite. And the suffering that human beings experience, the alienation, the sense of being in the wrong place, the inability to be fully satisfied by anything the material world offers, is not pathology. It is the structural consequence of being a being whose nature spans two incompatible registers of reality. The Nephilim tradition, read carefully, is saying the same thing with a different vocabulary and through a different narrative vehicle. The Nephilim are what happens when the spanning occurs without integration, when the two natures are present but not unified, when the divine component and the material component are in conflict rather than in the specific kind of alignment that the whole tradition is trying to teach. This is why the tradition of Enoch and the tradition of the Gnostic texts agree that the critical human task is not moral improvement in the conventional sense. It is not becoming better at navigating the material world. It is not obeying the right commandments. It is achieving the integration, the specific internal configuration that transforms the composite being from one that is torn between its two natures into one that has resolved that tension into a coherent whole. The Watchers created the Nephilim accidentally by bypassing the developmental sequence. Enoch's project, and the entire tradition he represents, is the long work of making that integration possible through a different route, not direct transmission, not the violent collision of two levels of reality in a single embodied form, but the slow, structured, text-mediated process of remembering what the divine component is, gradually, across generations, until the being that carries both natures has developed the interior architecture to hold them, without that holding tearing it apart. That is what this tradition is actually about. That is what the Watchers, Enoch, the Flood, the Nephilim, and the entire apparatus of the Enochic library is pointing at. Not ancient history, not mythology. The specific challenge of being the kind of being that you are. So let's slow down here and look at what the Enochic tradition actually built. Because once you understand that the whole apparatus, the Watchers, the descent, the mixing of natures, the flood, the preservation of Enoch, the library of texts, is pointing at the challenge of being a hybrid being in a material world that wasn't designed for what you are, the next question becomes practical. How does a tradition encode that kind of knowledge? How do you transmit to a future reader an understanding that cannot be conveyed through doctrine alone? The answer the Enochic tradition landed on is architectural, not metaphorical architecture. Literal structural choices in how the texts are built, layered, sequenced, and cross-referenced. The Book of the Watchers doesn't just tell you the Watchers descended. It builds the descent in stages, each stage adding a new layer of consequence, each layer revealing a different dimension of what it means to bring higher-order consciousness into contact with material reality. The reader doesn't receive the full picture at once. The reader is walked through it the same way consciousness itself moves through layers of increasing density as it falls from the pleroma into matter. This is not accidental. Texts composed with this kind of structural intentionality don't happen by chance. The Enochic authors, and there were multiple, writing across centuries, beginning somewhere around the 3rd century BCE, understood that the information they were transmitting was not the kind that could survive being stated plainly. Plain statement gets copied, gets institutionalized, gets turned into doctrine, and doctrine hollows out the living content and leaves the shell. They encoded it instead in story, in image, in layered cosmological narrative that requires the reader to do interior work to extract the meaning. The meaning is not on the surface, it is in the structure. Enoch himself is the key figure here, and his function in the tradition is worth examining in precise terms. He doesn't descend like the Watchers, he ascends. while the Watchers move from the realm of higher awareness into the density of matter, and are destroyed by that movement, because they moved without preparation, without the graduated integration the descent required. Enoch moves in the opposite direction. He is taken up. He traverses the heavens. He is shown the architecture of reality from the inside. He becomes the being who has seen both ends of the spectrum and returned to write about it. This is not a biographical detail. This is a template. The Enochic tradition is giving you a model of what successful navigation of the vertical axis of reality looks like. The Watchers show you what happens when the crossing is made, without preparation, without integration, without the interior structure that can hold both natures simultaneously. Enoch shows you what becomes possible when a being develops that interior structure across the course of a life, when the ascent is earned rather than seized. And here is what the tradition tells you about what Enoch saw at the top of that ascent. He saw the divine throne. He saw the structure of the heavens. He saw, in some accounts, his own transformation, the being he became through the process of traversal. In the later Enochic texts, particularly in what scholars call 3 Enoch, or Sefer Hekalot, composed somewhere in the 4th to 6th century CE, Enoch is transformed into the angel Metatron. He becomes Metatron, the prince of the divine presence, the highest of the angelic order, the being who stands in the closest possible proximity to the source of all that exists. Hold that image for a moment. A human being, a being born into matter, operating in the material world, navigating the same conditions you navigate, undertakes the work of internal integration, and emerges transformed into something that occupies the highest position in the cosmic hierarchy, below the unnameable itself. This is what the tradition is pointing at when it builds Enoch's story. Not a miracle that happened once to one exceptional man, a trajectory that is available to the being who does the work. But the tradition is also careful about this. It does not present the transformation as simple or automatic. The ascent is arduous. The levels of heaven Enoch traverses are not uniformly welcoming. Some are filled with presences that challenge, test, and resist his movement upward. The interior architecture required is built slowly, through sustained practice, through the kind of attention to one's own dual nature that the Enochic texts themselves are designed to cultivate in the reader. The tradition doesn't promise you Enoch's destination. It shows you Enoch's path, and then it hands you the map. Now we need to move to a question that almost nobody asks about this material, because the standard framing of Gnostic cosmology begins with the demiurge, begins with the Archons, begins with the construction of the material prison, and treats everything that came before that as prologue, background, setup. But that framing misses something fundamental. Before the Archons existed, there was a different order, not a better world in the sense of a world without conflict or challenge, but a different arrangement of the levels of reality, with different beings occupying the upper registers, and a different relationship between those upper registers and the material realm below. In the Enochic cosmological framework, the beings who occupy that upper register are the Watchers, and the Watchers are not Archons. This distinction matters enormously, and it is almost never made clearly in the popular presentation of this material. The Archons in Gnostic cosmology are creatures of the demiurge. They are the beings he appoints to administer the material realm, to enforce the conditions of the prison, to keep consciousness locked into the forgetting that material incarnation produces. They are, in a specific technical sense, the guardians of limitation. Their function is to prevent the upward movement of awareness that would allow a being to recognize its own true nature and break the cycle of incarnation. The Watchers are something categorically different. They predate the demiurgic construction. They exist in the tradition as members of the Divine Council, a concept found across the ancient Near East, attested in texts that scholars date centuries before the Gnostic synthesis. The Divine Council is the assembly of high-order beings who administer reality under the authority of the highest divine principle. In the Israelite tradition, these beings are called the sons of God, Bene Elohim. In the Ugaritic texts from which much of this material derives, they are the divine assembly, gathered around El, the high god of the Canaanite pantheon. They are not fallen beings. They are not demons. They are the original administrators of a reality that has not yet been fractured by the catastrophic error that produces the demiurge. This is the world before the Archons, a world administered by beings of genuine high-order awareness, operating in their proper domain, maintaining the structures of reality from a position of alignment with the source. The descent of the Watchers doesn't happen in a world already corrupted by archontic administration. It happens in the world before that corruption, which means the consequences of the descent are themselves part of the mechanism that makes the demiurgic construction possible or necessary. Here is where the two traditions, the Enochic and the Gnostic, converge on something that neither fully states on its own surface, but that becomes visible when you hold them simultaneously. The fracture in the divine order that produces the conditions for the demiurge's emergence. That fracture is not caused by the demiurge. The demiurge is a response to a fracture that was already present, and the Watcher descent, in the Enochic framework, is an account of that original fracture. The moment when beings of the divine order crossed into material reality without the integration that crossing required, and the consequences of that crossing began to cascade through the levels of reality. Sophia's fall, in the Gnostic account, is the story of that cascade, told from the inside of the pleroma, told from the perspective of what happens in the upper registers when the unconditioned reaches toward the conditioned without mediation. The Watcher descent is the story of the same cascade, told from the middle register, told from the perspective of what happens to beings who are already partly in relationship with matter, when that relationship becomes total and unmediated. Different vantage points, same event, same originating error, same consequence. And the consequence, in both accounts, is the creation of a class of beings who exist on the border between the divine and the material. Beings who carry both natures, who cannot be fully accommodated by either realm, and whose existence poses the central problem that every subsequent theological tradition is trying to solve. The Nephilim in the Enochic account, the divine sparks in the Gnostic account, different names, different mythological clothing, the same underlying ontological category. You are in that category. That is what this tradition is telling you. Not as flattery, not as spiritual marketing, as a precise description of what you are and why the world feels the way it does to a being with your particular architecture. There is a pattern visible across the entire history of this material that most people who encounter it never stop to notice. The knowledge keeps getting suppressed. Not once, not twice, over and over, across different centuries, different cultures, different institutional frameworks. The same information surfaces, gathers a community of people who recognize it as true, builds a tradition, and is then systematically dismantled by the dominant power structure of its moment. The Enochic literature was authoritative in Second Temple Judaism. The Book of the Watchers was read alongside what became the canonical Hebrew Bible. It was quoted in canonical texts. The New Testament letter of Jude contains a direct citation from 1 Enoch, a text that didn't make it into the final canon. The community at Qumran, the people who produced and preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, had more copies of 1 Enoch than of any other single work except for Psalms and Deuteronomy. This was not fringe material. This was central to the intellectual and spiritual life of a significant stream of ancient Judaism, and then it was removed. The rabbinical tradition that consolidated in the period after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE systematically excluded the Enochic material from the emerging canon of authoritative Jewish texts. The reasons given were textual and procedural. The texts weren't attributed to Moses. They were associated with sectarian groups that the emerging rabbinical mainstream wanted to distance itself from. But the effect was total. Within a few centuries, 1 Enoch had essentially vanished from the Jewish intellectual tradition. It survived primarily in the Ethiopian church, which preserved it in the Ge'ez language, and which is why when scholars talk about 1 Enoch today, they are working primarily from the Ethiopic text. The Gnostic traditions underwent the same process with greater violence. The Nag Hammadi texts, discovered in 1945 in that jar buried in the Egyptian desert, survived because someone buried them. They were buried, scholars believe, sometime in the late 4th century CE, around the time when the edicts of Theodosius were making the possession of heterodox texts not just socially unacceptable, but legally dangerous. People hid these texts to preserve them, and then whoever hid them either died or fled or was killed, and the texts lay in the ground for 16 centuries. These are not two separate historical accidents. This is a pattern, and patterns require explanation. The explanation the tradition itself offers is structural. Information about the true nature of human beings, information that reveals the divine component, that describes the mechanisms of the prison, that provides the tools for beginning to work toward liberation from the conditions the demiurge maintains. This information is inherently threatening to every power structure that depends on those conditions remaining invisible. If you know you are a divine spark temporarily housed in a material body, you do not need an institution to mediate your relationship with the divine. You do not need a priest. You do not need a temple. You do not need a hierarchy that claims to stand between you and the source. The institution becomes irrelevant the moment the knowledge becomes available. This is not a paranoid reading. This is what the early Christian heresiologists, the writers whose job it was to identify and combat Gnostic ideas, themselves said. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in the late 2nd century CE, was explicit. The Gnostics were dangerous not primarily because their theology was wrong, but because their theology eliminated the need for the institutional church. If every person has direct access to the divine through the spark within them, there is no functional role for the bishop, the sacrament, the apostolic succession. Irenaeus understood this clearly. He wrote against it clearly. And the tradition he was defending won, which is why you are encountering this material in a format like this, rather than having been taught it in a school or a church. But here is what the suppression pattern also reveals, if you look at it carefully. The knowledge keeps coming back. Every time it is buried, it resurfaces somewhere else, in some other form, under some other name. The Cathars in medieval southern France were building a tradition recognizably continuous with Gnostic ideas 12 centuries after Irenaeus declared those ideas dead. The alchemical tradition of the Renaissance was encoding the same cosmological framework in the language of chemical transformation. The Romantic poets were reaching for the same understanding of the spark's relationship to its source. The knowledge doesn't die when you bury it. It migrates. It finds new vessels. It waits. That persistence is itself data. It tells you something about the nature of the knowledge, that it is not a cultural artifact that can be permanently erased, but something that keeps being rediscovered, because the beings who need it keep being born into the world and keep eventually finding their way back to it. You are one of those beings. That is why you are here. Most treatments of the Nephilim stop at the surface level. They were the offspring of the Watchers and human women. They were giants. They were violent. They corrupted the earth. God sent the flood to destroy them. End of story. That reading is accurate as far as it goes. But it stops at precisely the point where the tradition becomes most interesting, because it doesn't ask the question that the text is structured to make you ask, what were the Nephilim actually for? Not in the sense of what the Watchers intended when they produced them. The tradition is clear that the Watchers' motivations were not purely pedagogical. There was desire involved, transgression involved, a violation of the boundary between the levels of reality that the tradition clearly regards as a catastrophic error. But intention and function are not the same thing. The flood is God's response to the catastrophe that the Nephilim represent. But the flood does not eliminate them permanently. The tradition itself acknowledges this. In Numbers 13, in the account of the Israelite scouts sent into Canaan, the scouts report seeing Nephilim there, after the flood. The very catastrophe God sent to erase them didn't erase them. This is not a continuity error. This is a theological statement. The class of being that the Nephilim represent, hybrid, born of the mixing of two levels of reality, carrying both natures in a single embodied form, cannot be permanently eliminated by an event that operates only within the material realm, because the material event, however total, cannot reach the part of the being that belongs to the other level. The flood can destroy the body. It cannot destroy what the Watcher nature contributed. That component is not subject to material destruction. So the Nephilim keep appearing, not because the story is inconsistent, but because the tradition is encoding something precise about the nature of this category of being. it is self-perpetuating. Once the crossing has been made, and the mixing has occurred, the offspring carry the capacity forward. The hybrid nature propagates. The tradition doesn't resolve this by eliminating it. It lives with it, because it is describing something that is actually happening in the world the tradition is trying to account for. Now look at what the Nephilim actually brought into the world according to the Enochic account. The Watchers, according to 1 Enoch, taught their offspring, and through their offspring, humanity more broadly, specific forms of knowledge. Asael taught the working of metals, the making of weapons and jewelry. Shemihaza and his companions taught enchantments, the cutting of roots, astrology. Other Watchers taught other arts. The tradition frames this teaching as part of the problem. It's presented as forbidden knowledge that corrupts humanity and contributes to the violence and disorder that makes the flood necessary. But look at what the knowledge actually is: metallurgy, astronomy, the medicinal and ritual uses of plants. These are not random corruptions. These are the foundational technologies of civilization. The knowledge the Watchers transmitted through the Nephilim is the knowledge that allows human beings to begin operating at a level of sophistication and intentionality that exceeds pure biological instinct. It is the knowledge that makes culture possible, that makes the kind of sustained, multi-generational transmission of understanding that we call civilization possible. The tradition condemns it because it arrives before humanity is ready for it, through a channel that violated the proper structure of how that knowledge was supposed to come. The timing is wrong. The mechanism is wrong. The consequences are catastrophic. But the knowledge itself, the specific forms of knowing that the Nephilim carry into the world, is not arbitrary. It is exactly the knowledge that a being trying to operate consciously in a material realm would need. And this is the function of the Nephilim that the surface reading misses entirely. They are not simply monsters or giants or corrupting influences. They are the first generation of beings who are simultaneously inside material reality and carrying the forms of awareness and knowledge that allow material reality to be engaged with consciously, rather than merely inhabited instinctively. They are proto-humans in the fullest sense, the first beings who have both the material constitution to exist in this realm and the upper register awareness to begin actually understanding it. That their arrival is catastrophic is not evidence that the project was wrong. It is evidence that the project was premature and unmediated. The tradition that follows, the entire arc of the Enochic library, the Gnostic synthesis, the tradition of graduated initiation and interior development, is the long work of finding a way to accomplish the same integration that the Nephilim represent, but through a process that doesn't tear the fabric of reality apart in the process. Slowly, carefully, through the work of individuals who choose to undertake it, rather than beings who are born into it without preparation or consent. This is where the tradition pivots, not away from the Watchers, never away from them, but forward from them. Because what the Watchers attempted through sheer ontological force, through the collision of two incompatible registers of being, the initiatory traditions that followed them attempted through something far more demanding, through discipline, through incremental interior development, through the slow, deliberate work of becoming something that can hold both registers simultaneously, without collapsing under the weight of either. The tradition of graduated initiation is not a religious phenomenon in the ordinary sense. It is not about joining an institution, or accepting a creed, or performing ritual behaviors in exchange for divine approval. It is a technical program, a structured approach to solving a specific problem that the Watcher catastrophe made visible, that higher-order consciousness cannot be imported into lower-order material reality without a prepared vessel. The vessel has to be built from the inside. It has to be grown. Every major initiatory tradition in the ancient world understood this. The Egyptian mystery schools, the Orphic traditions of the Greek world, the Pythagorean communities, the later Neoplatonists, the Gnostic schools that flourished in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. All of them, regardless of the specific cosmological vocabulary they used, were working on the same fundamental problem. How do you develop a human being to the point where they can hold genuine gnosis, genuine direct contact with the upper registers of reality, without that contact destroying the person or destroying their capacity to function in the world? The answer across all of these traditions was the same, gradually, in stages, with specific preparatory work done at each stage before the next stage is approached. This is not esotericism for the sake of secrecy. This is medicine. You don't give a patient the full dose on the first day. You build tolerance. You prepare the system. You work with the individual's actual current capacity, rather than the capacity you wish they had. The Enochic texts understood this explicitly. The Book of the Watchers is not simply a cautionary tale about angelic transgression. It is a diagnostic document. It identifies what went wrong, unmediated contact between incompatible registers, and it implies the corrective by negative example. If you read the Watcher's failure closely, you can extract from it a precise description of what successful integration would require. It would require beings who develop the upper register awareness incrementally, in a body that has been specifically prepared for it, in a context of genuine understanding of what they are undertaking and why. Everything the Watchers lacked, everything the initiatory path provides. The Gnostic schools made this explicit in a way that earlier traditions only implied. The pneumatic, the individual in whom the divine spark is most fully present and most actively engaged, is not born complete. The spark is there, but the capacity to consciously work with it, to operate from it, rather than merely be driven by it in unconscious ways, requires development. The Valentinian tradition in particular was precise about this. The pneumatic type carries the raw material of higher consciousness. What they do not automatically carry is the developed structure that allows them to work with it skillfully. That structure has to be built. That is what the initiatory process builds. This is why the Gnostic schools were schools, not temples, not churches, not institutions oriented primarily toward collective worship or social cohesion. Schools, places where specific knowledge was transmitted in a specific sequence to individuals who demonstrated the specific readiness to receive each stage. The school structure is not accidental. It is a precise response to the problem the Watcher narrative identified. And here is what makes this relevant to you, sitting with this now, in this moment. The Watcher's failure was not a failure of intention, it was a failure of process. They had access to something real. They wanted to transmit it. The impulse was not wrong. What was wrong was the method. Direct, unmediated, total transmission into a system not prepared to receive it. What the initiatory tradition developed in the wake of that failure was the method, the slow version, the survivable version, the one that doesn't leave a legacy of giants and catastrophe, and a world that has to be wiped clean and started again. The question the Watcher narrative ultimately poses is not whether this transmission can happen. It clearly can. It did. The question is whether it can happen in a way that doesn't destroy everything it touches. The answer the tradition arrived at is yes, but only through the work, only through the long, patient interior work of building a self that can actually hold what it is being given. Every time the conversation turns to Archons, people start at the wrong point. They begin with the prison, with the hierarchy of cosmic administrators who manage this material realm and maintain the conditions that keep human consciousness contracted, compliant, and amnesiac about its actual nature. They begin there because that is where the Gnostic texts spend a great deal of their most vivid descriptive energy, naming the Archons, mapping their hierarchy, detailing their methods and their reach. But the Archons are not the beginning of the story. They are what happens after the beginning goes wrong. They are downstream from a more fundamental event. To understand what the Archons are, what they actually represent in the structure of this cosmological model, you have to understand what they came after. And what they came after is the Watchers, or more precisely, what the Watchers opened. Here is the sequence as the texts lay it out, once you read across the tradition, rather than within any single text. The upper realm, the pleroma, the fullness, the domain of complete and integrated divine light, generates lower emanations. This process goes wrong in some specific way. In the Sophianic narrative it goes wrong, through Sophia's unmediated creative act. In the Enochic framework it goes wrong through the descent of luminous beings who enter the material register without the containment their nature requires. In both cases, the result is the same, a fracture, a breach between registers. a crack in the structure of reality through which something pours that was never meant to be here in this form. What pours through that crack, in the Gnostic account, becomes the material world as we know it. And the material world as we know it is not simply a neutral lower realm. It is a realm administered by beings who themselves emerged from that fracture, beings who were not generated by the pleroma, not expressions of the divine fullness, but products of the error, the Archons. This is crucial to understand. The Archons do not predate the Watchers. They do not predate Sophia's fall. They are constituted by those events. They are, in a very precise sense, what the fracture produced. They are the governing intelligence of the closed system, the system that formed when the crack sealed itself into a discrete realm, rather than reintegrating with the upper order. They manage a world that came into being through error, and they manage it in the image of that error, unconsciously, mechanically, without access to the genuine light that would allow them to know what they are doing or why. The Demiurge, the chief Archon, the one who declares himself God because he genuinely does not know there is anything above him, is in many Gnostic texts described as blind. The Apocryphon of John, the hypostasis of the Archons, the text we call On the Origin of the World, all of them use this image. Blindness. Not malice exactly, not a conscious program of deception and cruelty conceived from a position of full knowledge. Blindness. The Demiurge and his subordinate Archons administer a closed system. They cannot see outside it. They cannot perceive the pleroma, whose fractured emanation is the only reason they exist at all. This changes everything about how you understand the Archonic system. It is not a consciously orchestrated conspiracy. It is a closed feedback loop, a system of governance, generated by an error, perpetuating the conditions of that error, because the governing intelligence itself is a product of the error and has no access to anything outside it. It is not evil in the way a human tyrant is evil. It is something more disturbing than that. It is unconscious. It is automatic. It is a structure that perpetuates itself because it cannot do anything else. The Watchers matter here because they represent the first real penetration of that closed system from above. The first time something from the upper register actually entered the lower realm in a form that had real effects. Their arrival is catastrophic, yes. The texts are consistent about that. But the catastrophe is evidence of the penetration. Something from outside the closed system actually got in. That matters. That is not a small thing, because the Archon's power rests entirely on the closure of the system, on the completeness of the amnesia, on the human spark being fully convinced, for the duration of a lifetime, that this realm is all there is. The Watcher's arrival, even in its catastrophic form, broke that assumption, permanently. The knowledge they transmitted, even in the distorted form it survived in, carries within it the seed of the Archon's eventual irrelevance. Not their defeat in a military sense, their irrelevance. The moment enough human beings develop the interior capacity to recognize the spark within them and orient to it consciously, the Archonic system loses its only real power, the management of what you believe about your own nature. The flood came, the Nephilim died, the rebel Watchers were bound, imprisoned in the valleys of the earth according to the Book of Enoch, until the final judgment. The world was wiped and rebuilt on safer terms. And if you read the story superficially, that looks like an ending. The divine intervention succeeded. The corruption was purged. Order was restored. But something survived. Something always survives in these narratives, and it is never an accident. What survives is always precisely what needed to survive to make the continuation of the larger project possible. What survived the flood, according to the tradition when you read it carefully, was not simply biological humanity. What survived was the transmission, the knowledge the Watchers had brought down, the encoded understanding of the upper registers, the memory of what consciousness is at its source, the capacity for gnosis. It did not survive intact. It did not survive in a clean, undistorted form that anyone could simply access by reading the right book. It survived fragmented, encoded, embedded in the lineages that carried it forward, in the traditions of the wise, in the lineages of those who understood what they were carrying, even if they could not always articulate it, in the cosmological vocabulary that would eventually give it its clearest expression. The Hermetic tradition traces itself back to this transmission, not metaphorically, literally. The claim of Hermeticism is that there is a chain of transmission of interior knowledge that runs from the earliest contact between luminous beings and human consciousness, through the Egyptian mysteries, through the Platonic schools, through the Neoplatonists, into the Gnostic synthesis of the first centuries of the Common Era. The chain is not always clean, the transmission is not always undistorted, but the chain exists, and what it transmits, at its core, is always the same thing: the recognition that the human being contains something that does not belong to this realm, that did not originate here, and that has a nature and a capacity that this realm's governing structures actively work to prevent from being recognized. This is the inheritance the Watchers left, not civilization in the ordinary sense, not agriculture or metallurgy or writing, though the texts attribute all of those to the Watcher transmission. Those are the surface layer. The deep inheritance is the interior one, the knowing that there is something within human consciousness that is genuinely from elsewhere, that the spark is real, that the amnesia is imposed, not natural, that the archonic closure of this realm is not total, because it was breached before, and the trace of that breach persists in every human being who carries it. The Gnostic writers who synthesized this tradition in Alexandria and Antioch and Rome in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era understood themselves to be the custodians of that transmission. The Valentinians, the Sethians, the school of Basilides, these were not people who invented a new religion. They understood themselves to be preserving and clarifying an understanding that was vastly older than Christianity, vastly older than the Judaism that preceded it, reaching back to the primordial contact between the upper registers and the lower world that the Enochic texts described. They used the vocabulary of their era, Greek philosophical categories, Platonic cosmology, the emerging Christian narrative, as a framework for expressing something they believed predated all of those frameworks. And here is what I find genuinely extraordinary about that. The Gnostic synthesis emerged at one of the most turbulent and creative moments in the history of Western consciousness. The old Mediterranean religious world was dissolving, something new was forming. In that moment of maximal fluidity, these schools reached backward, not forward, for their foundation. They reached back to the oldest stratum of the tradition they could access, to the Enochic material, to the tradition of the Watchers and the transmission they carried, because they understood that the most urgent question of their moment, what is the human being, what is this realm, what is the path out of the amnesia, had already been posed by that oldest stratum, and partially answered. The partial answer the Watchers provided is this: the upper register can enter the lower one. The divine light can be present within material consciousness. The amnesia is not permanent and not total. Something persists, something carries forward. Something in the human being knows what it is, beneath the layers of forgetting, beneath the conditioning of a realm that depends on that forgetting for its continued operation. That knowing is the inheritance. It is the thing the Watchers left behind when everything else they brought was burned and flooded and bound and silenced. It persisted because it was not a thing that could be destroyed from the outside. It was encoded in the structure of a certain kind of human consciousness, and it waited. Through the flood, through the centuries of silence, through the millennia of institutional religion working to replace it with obedience, for individuals capable of recognizing it and doing something with it. You came to this story because something drew you to it. That is not a small thing. Most people who encounter this material at the surface level, the angels who fell, the giants, the flood, treat it as mythology in the dismissive sense. Interesting, ancient, irrelevant, something that happened to other people in a time so distant it has no purchase on the present. You did not treat it that way. Something in you recognized that it was describing something real, not real in the sense of a historical news report, though there are historical dimensions to it that deserve to be taken seriously. Real in the sense that it was describing the structure of your situation, the architecture of the world you actually live in, and the nature of the consciousness you actually carry. That recognition, that moment of reading something ancient and feeling it describe your present experience with more precision than anything produced last week, is itself a form of the inheritance the Watchers left. It is the spark recognizing a description of itself. The Gnostic tradition calls this anamnesis, unforgetting, not learning something new, remembering something you already knew, at a level deeper than ordinary cognition. The information did not create the recognition. The recognition was already there. The information just cleared enough of the overlay for it to surface. So let me be direct about what this entire narrative has been building toward. Because the story of the Watchers is not ultimately about the Watchers. It is about you. It is about the position you occupy in a structure that this tradition mapped with remarkable precision, thousands of years before the vocabulary to express it clearly had been assembled. You are the continuation of what the Watchers started. Not in a grandiose sense, not in the sense that you are fallen angels or divine beings incarnated in flesh. In a more precise and more demanding sense, you are the heir of the problem they identified and the failure they demonstrated. The problem is real. The integration of upper register consciousness with material existence, the full, conscious, functional presence of the divine spark within a human life in this realm, is not something that happened automatically when humanity was formed. It is something that has to be built, earned, developed through the interior work that the initiatory traditions spent millennia designing and preserving. The Archons are not your enemy in the way a military adversary is an enemy. They are a condition, a structural feature of the realm you were born into. They maintain the amnesia that keeps the spark unconscious and inert. They do not do this through individual malice. Remember, they are blind. They cannot see what they are managing. They do this through the automatic operation of a system specifically configured to prevent the very recognition you are having right now. The gravity of this realm, the weight of its conditioning, the density of its forgetting, these are archonic in nature. They are the prison, and the prison works by making you forget there is anything outside it. The Watchers broke through, imperfectly, catastrophically, with consequences that required millennia to process. But they broke through. They established that the closure is not total, that the system can be penetrated from above and can be recognized from within, that the amnesia, however deep, is not permanent, that something from the pleroma can be genuinely present in this realm without the realm being able to extinguish it, only bury it, only layer over it, only keep it unconscious through the continuous application of the conditions that produce forgetting. Your work, and I use that word deliberately because this is work, not passive reception, is to do consciously and gradually what the Watchers did unconsciously and catastrophically, to develop the interior capacity to hold the spark consciously, to build the structure that can contain the upper register awareness without collapsing under its weight, to undertake, one day at a time, the long process of anamnesis, the unforgetting of what you are underneath the conditioning of a realm that needed you to forget. This is not a mystical abstraction, it is a practical program. It looks like the sustained practice of interior attention, like the willingness to examine what you actually believe versus what you have been conditioned to believe, like the development of the capacity to sit with the discomfort of not fitting neatly into the consensus reality that this realm's management systems produce and maintain. It looks like the work that every genuine initiatory tradition has always pointed toward, from the Egyptian schools to the Valentinian communities, to the Neoplatonic circles, to the contemplative lineages that carried pieces of this understanding through every century since. The Watchers came before the Archons in the deepest sense, not just chronologically, ontologically. The act of transmission preceded the architecture of containment. The light got in before the walls were fully built. And that sequence matters, because it means the light is already here, already inside the system, already encoded in the structure of a consciousness like yours, the kind that finds itself drawn across all the noise of a world designed to prevent exactly this kind of attention, to a story about beings who fell because they carried something too large for the world they entered, and who left behind, in the wreckage of that falling, the very seed of everything the tradition that followed them spent the next several thousand years trying to help the rest of us grow.